My name is Lydia. I am 33 years old. My parents received $5,000 a month from me so they could live comfortably. But on my wedding day, as I stood in my gown waiting to walk down the aisle, I looked out the window and saw their front row seats were completely empty. When I frantically called my mother, she answered over the sound of clinking champagne glasses and snapped that my brother needed them to close on his new lake house. She told me not to bother them because it was just a wedding. I hung up the phone, my hands shaking, and immediately opened my banking app to close every single account in my name. 30 minutes later, they called me frantically. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been pushed to your absolute limit by the people who were supposed to love you most. The sunlight streamed brilliantly through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the bridal suite at the Chicago Botanical Garden. It was a perfect Saturday afternoon in late June, exactly the kind of day you dream about when you spend a year planning an outdoor wedding. The air outside was warm, but carried a gentle, comfortable breeze, and the manicured gardens below were bursting with vibrant summer colors. I stood in front of the full-length vintage mirror, taking a deep breath to steady my racing heart. My wedding gown fit absolutely perfectly. It was a classic A-line dress with delicate lace detailing along the bodice and a long sweeping train that I had paid for entirely on my own. I paid for the venue, the catering, the massive floral arrangements, and the string quartet currently playing softly on the green lawn below. David, my fiancé, was a highly successful local restaurateur who had insisted on splitting the wedding costs evenly with me, but I took immense pride in pulling my own weight. I am the founder and chief executive officer of a business-to-business cloud logistics software company. Over the past decade, I built my business from a tiny, cramped studio apartment into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. I was accustomed to managing massive corporate crises, handling high-stakes financial negotiations, and keeping my composure under immense pressure. But looking out that bridal suite window, down at the pristine ceremony space, my professional composure was rapidly crumbling into pieces. There were exactly 20 minutes left before I was scheduled to walk down the aisle. The guests were already taking their seats, their joyful chatter drifting up to my window. I could see David standing near the spectacular floral arch, looking incredibly handsome and relaxed in his tailored charcoal suit. He was smiling broadly, chatting amiably with his parents, who had flown in from Denver 2 days early just to help us set up decorations. His family was warm, present, engaged, and genuinely thrilled to welcome me into their lives. My side of the aisle, however, told a drastically different story. In the very front row, right where the parents of the bride should be seated, there were 4 chairs with elegant reserved signs draped across their backs. Those chairs were explicitly meant for my father Richard, my mother Patricia, my older brother Cameron, and his wife Whitney. All 4 of those chairs were completely empty. At first, I tried to rationalize the terrible sight. Chicago traffic could be notoriously brutal, especially on a sunny summer weekend with tourists flooding the city. Maybe they took a wrong turn off the highway. Maybe they were stuck behind an accident on the expressway. Maybe the car service I had hired for them had been delayed at their hotel. But a cold, familiar knot was already forming deep in my stomach, spreading a heavy dread through my veins. I knew my family. I knew their lifelong patterns of behavior. Cameron was 36 years old, chronically unemployed, constantly bouncing between failed business ventures, yet he somehow remained the undisputed, untouchable golden boy of our family. Whenever Cameron experienced even a minor inconvenience, the entire family orbit immediately shifted to accommodate his feelings. But this was my wedding day. Surely they would not let his typical drama interfere with my wedding. Surely my own parents would not abandon me minutes before I said my vows. I watched the minutes tick by relentlessly on the antique wall clock. 15 minutes until the music changed for the bridal march. My 3 bridesmaids were hovering near the suite door, casting worried glances at me, and then exchanging nervous looks with each other. They knew my family history. They knew how hard I had worked to keep the peace, to be the dutiful daughter, to earn a fraction of the approval my parents showered onto Cameron for simply existing. I picked up my phone from the wooden vanity table. My hands were trembling slightly as I scrolled to find my mother's contact and pressed the call button. I held the phone to my ear, listening as it rang 3 times. With each ring, my heart pounded harder and harder against my ribs, threatening to break through my chest. Finally, the call connected. I desperately expected to hear the rushed, apologetic tone of someone stuck in terrible traffic or running late from the hotel lobby. Instead, I heard the unmistakable, joyful sounds of a celebration. There was loud, happy chatter in the background, upbeat music playing from a speaker, and the distinct, sharp clink of crystal champagne glasses toasting together. "Mom," I asked, my voice rising with a mixture of pure panic and utter confusion. "Where are you?" "The ceremony starts in 15 minutes. David is already waiting at the altar." There was a loud, obnoxious laugh on the other end of the line. I recognized it instantly. It belonged to Whitney, my vain materialistic sister-in-law. Then my mother spoke, her tone dripping with sheer annoyance, as if I had rudely interrupted her favorite television show rather than calling about my own wedding. "Lydia, please lower your voice. We are at the title company office, and then we are heading straight to the country club for a celebratory lunch." The title company, I repeated the words, tasting like bitter ash in my mouth. "Mom, today is my wedding. What are you doing at a title company right now?" My mother sighed. It was a heavy, dramatic sound that she always used when she felt she was dealing with a particularly unreasonable child. "Cameron is having a major crisis with the closing on his new lake house. There was an unexpected issue with the paperwork and the escrow funds this morning. He was incredibly stressed out, Lydia. You know how bad his anxiety gets when things do not go his way. He needs his parents right now to support him through this massive milestone in his life, a lake house." My older brother, who had not held a steady-paying job in 5 years, was closing on a luxury lake house, and my parents were missing my wedding to hold his hand through the real estate paperwork. "Mom," I said, my voice breaking completely, despite my absolute best efforts to stay strong. "I am sitting in my bridal suite. I am wearing my wedding dress. I am about to walk down the aisle in 10 minutes. You are my mother. You are supposed to be here with me." My mother did not miss a single beat. Her voice hardened instantly, losing any remaining trace of maternal warmth or guilt. "Do not try to guilt trip us today, Lydia. Cameron is making a huge, important investment for his future, and his wife is very emotional about the delay. You are a strong, independent woman who always likes to do things her own way. You do not need us there holding your hand like a little girl. It is just a wedding, Lydia. Do not bother us today." The line went completely dead. She hung up on me. She hung up on her own daughter mere minutes before her wedding ceremony to go drink champagne and celebrate with her unemployed son. I lowered the phone slowly from my ear, staring blindly at the dark screen. The silence in the bridal suite felt absolutely deafening. My bridesmaids were perfectly still, watching my face for any reaction, terrified to speak. I turned slowly to look out the large window one last time. The 4 empty chairs stared back at me, a glaring, painful physical representation of my exact place in the family hierarchy. I had spent my entire adult life trying to buy their love, trying to be the perfect, financially responsible daughter, constantly hoping that one day they would look at me with the same pride and unyielding adoration they reserved exclusively for Cameron. But looking at those empty chairs, the truth finally snapped into sharp, undeniable focus. I was never going to be enough for them. I was never going to be respected. I was just a convenient resource, an automated teller machine. I realized in that single shattering moment that the family I had been so desperately trying to hold together did not actually exist. The parents who were supposed to walk me down the aisle and celebrate the happiest day of my life had chosen their own comfort and my brother's entitlement over my basic human dignity. They did not care about the humiliation of leaving me to face my future husband's family alone. They did not care about the thousands of dollars spent on their dinners and accommodations. All they cared about was Cameron and his brand new lake house. A profound, icy calmness suddenly washed over my entire body completely, replacing the grief and the panic that had been suffocating me just moments before. I wiped a single stray tear from my cheek, making sure not to ruin my carefully applied makeup. I took a deep, steadying breath and looked at my reflection in the mirror once more. The scared, eager to please daughter was gone. The successful, ruthless business owner remained, and she had some serious financial adjustments to make before the music started playing. I stared down at the glowing screen of my phone, my thumb hovering over the banking application icon. For 4 long, exhausting years, I had been the silent, reliable financial pillar, holding up my parents' entirely fabricated lifestyle. The memories of my early 20s flashed through my mind in rapid succession, painting a stark, painful contrast to the luxurious botanical gardens surrounding me now. While my peers were out traveling the world, networking at industry events, or simply enjoying the carefree freedoms of their youth, I was confined to a tiny, drafty studio apartment on the outskirts of the city. I poured every waking hour into building my software company from absolutely nothing functioning on minimal sleep and a diet consisting mostly of cheap instant noodles. And every single month without fail, I transferred exactly $5,000 into a joint savings account I shared with my parents. I did it because I believed their lies. 4 years ago, my father had sat me down in their comfortable living room, his face buried in his hands in a masterful display of defeat, while my mother wept softly beside him. They claimed a severe market downturn had completely wiped out their retirement portfolios. They told me they were terrified of losing their home, of not being able to afford basic weekly groceries or their necessary medical bills. As their successful, capable daughter, they pleaded with me to uphold my family duty. I did not hesitate. I set up the automatic transfers, sacrificing my own comfort, my savings, and my financial security to ensure they could live comfortably in their golden years. Now, the sickening, undeniable reality washed over me. There was no catastrophic medical crisis. There was no risk of starvation or imminent foreclosure. They had been crying poverty to me while simultaneously holding my unemployed brother's hand as he purchased a luxury lake house. The $5,000 I bled for every month was not paying for my parents' survival. It was padding my golden child brother's bank account. They were taking the money I earned through sleepless nights and pouring it directly into Cameron's pockets so he could maintain a lifestyle he had never earned. A cold, clinical precision took over my movements. My thumb pressed down on the banking app icon. The screen authenticated my face and my financial dashboard loaded instantly. I navigated straight to the joint family savings account. I was the primary account holder, having set it up using my own stellar credit history, when they claimed theirs was completely ruined by the fictional market crash. The current balance stared back at me in bold green numbers: $80,000. That was the sum total of my blood, sweat, and sacrificed youth sitting in an account that my parents and Cameron treated like a limitless personal slush fund. I knew exactly what that money was doing right now. It was sitting in escrow, acting as the critical proof of funds for Cameron's luxury real estate closing. My parents were sitting comfortably at the title company office, acting as the proud supportive benefactors, ready to authorize the final transfer to secure his dream home using my hard-earned cash. They were so confident in my blind obedience that they did not even bother to pretend to care about my wedding day. My fingers moved rapidly across the glass screen. I tapped the transfer button. I selected the joint account as the origin and my private, heavily protected corporate limited liability company holding account as the destination. I typed in the full amount: $80,000 and 0 cents. The banking application prompted me with a standard warning about large transfers and potential processing times. But since both accounts were irrevocably linked to my primary corporate profile, the internal transfer would be executed instantly. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I hit confirm. I hit. The screen loaded briefly before displaying a bright, beautiful green check mark. Transaction successful. I refreshed the page just to be absolutely certain. The joint account balance now read a glorious, undeniable zero. But I was not finished yet. I navigated to my scheduled payments dashboard. There it sat, the recurring monthly auto transfer of $5,000 scheduled to withdraw next Tuesday. With one sharp tap, I deleted the schedule. I canceled the mandate. I completely severed the financial umbilical cord that had been choking me for 4 years. They wanted to treat me like an automated teller machine, ignoring my existence until they needed a convenient payout. But machines can be unplugged, and I had just pulled the plug on their entire false reality. I locked my phone, slipped it into my white silk bridal clutch, and handed it to my maid of honor. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, clearly expecting me to burst into tears, ruin my makeup, or cancel the wedding entirely. Instead, I stood up straighter than I had in my entire life. I smoothed the delicate lace on my bodice, adjusted my long veil, and offered her a calm, genuine smile. "It is time," I said, my voice steady and clear, ringing with newfound authority. The heavy wooden doors of the bridal suite opened, and we made our way down the grand staircase toward the garden. As I stepped out into the bright, warm summer sunlight, the string quartet seamlessly transitioned into the bridal chorus. The guests stood up, turning toward me with warm, expectant smiles. I could hear a few quiet gasps and whispered murmurs as people realized I was walking alone, without a father to escort me. I did not care. I did not look at the empty front row chairs. I did not spare a single thought for the people who chose a real estate transaction over my sacred wedding vows. I looked straight ahead at David. He stepped forward at the end of the aisle, his eyes shining with profound love and unwavering support. He knew my internal struggles. He knew the heavy burden I carried regarding my family's constant demands. Seeing me walk down that aisle alone, he did not look pitying or sorrowful. He looked incredibly proud of the woman I was. I walked down the aisle with my head held high, every single step feeling lighter than the last. I was not a victim abandoned by her toxic family. I was a self-made woman walking toward a bright future. I had chosen a future I had built alongside a man who truly valued me. The ceremony was flawless. The vows we exchanged were promises of genuine partnership, not obligations born of toxic guilt or manipulation. When David kissed me, the applause from our chosen family, our true friends, and his wonderful relatives filled the entire botanical garden, completely drowning out the absence of the people who shared my blood. The transition into the reception was seamless and joyous. We moved into the grand glass conservatory surrounded by lush tropical plants and twinkling fairy lights draped across the high ceiling. The atmosphere was electric with pure joy. I danced, I laughed, and I drank expensive champagne with people who actually wanted to be present in my life. I felt a profound sense of liberation, completely untethered from the heavy, suffocating chains of my family's expectations. For the first time, I was breathing free air. 30 minutes into the reception, as the guests were finding their designated seats for the first gourmet course, my maid of honor approached me. She was holding my silk bridal clutch, looking slightly alarmed. "Lydia," she whispered, leaning in close so as not to disturb the joyful ambiance at our head table. "Your phone has been vibrating nonstop for the past 10 minutes. It is literally buzzing off the table. I think it might be important." I took the clutch, my heart perfectly calm, knowing exactly what was happening on the other side of the city. I pulled out my phone and looked at the brightly lit lock screen. There were 27 missed calls. Every single one of them was from Patricia. My screen was also flooded with a barrage of frantic text messages from both my mother and my brother. I tapped the screen to read the previews, enjoying the precise timeline of their collapsing world. The first message from my mother was typed in all capital letters, demanding to know why her premium credit card was declined at the country club when she tried to pay for their celebratory lunch. The second message, sent only 2 minutes later, was a frantic, error-filled plea asking if there was a glitch with the bank servers. But it was the third message, sent by Cameron, that made a slow, highly satisfied smile spread across my face. "Lydia, answer the phone right now. My lake house closing just bounced. The title company says the escrow account is completely frozen and the balance is zero. The sellers are threatening to walk away and keep my earnest money. What did you do? Call Mom immediately. I read the message twice, letting the sweet taste of absolute justice settle over me. I locked the phone screen, silencing the buzzing device in the palm of my hand. I slipped it back into my clutch, picked up my crystal champagne glass, and turned back to my new husband, who was watching me with a curious smile. The storm had officially arrived at their doorstep, but for the very first time in my life, I was the one controlling the weather. The first course was cleared away by the impeccable catering staff moving silently among the tables. The soft clinking of silverware against fine china provided a gentle, elegant rhythm to the beautiful evening. David stood up, tapping his crystal glass to command the attention of our 200 guests. His best man had just delivered a hilarious and deeply touching speech, and now it was the groom's turn to speak. David looked down at me, his expression radiating pure adoration and profound respect. He spoke about our journey together, about my relentless dedication to building my software company from the ground up, and how my strength inspired him every single day. I sat there basking in the warmth of his words and the genuine, heartfelt applause of the room. The stark contrast between this room full of love and the toxic dynamic I had endured for 33 years was absolutely staggering. I took another sip of my champagne, feeling lighter than air. The frantic vibrations from my silk clutch had finally ceased a few minutes prior. I assumed my parents and my brother had realized their tantrums would yield no results. I assumed they were currently scrambling to salvage Cameron's precious real estate deal using their own hidden funds. I severely underestimated their sheer audacity. They were never going to handle their own problems when they could simply demand that I fix them. David was just reaching the concluding sentiments of his beautiful toast when a loud, jarring crash echoed through the glass conservatory. The massive, ornate wooden double doors at the main entrance of the venue burst open with violent force. The heavy doors slammed against the walls, completely shattering the elegant, romantic atmosphere we had carefully cultivated for over a year. The string quartet stopped playing instantly, ending on a harsh, discordant note that made people jump. 200 guests turned in their seats simultaneously, their faces transitioning from joyful attention to absolute shock. Standing in the grand entryway, breathing heavily, and looking completely unhinged were my father Richard, my mother Patricia, and my older brother Cameron. They had not bothered to dress for a formal wedding. They had not even bothered to change out of the clothes they wore to their celebratory title company lunch. Richard wore a wrinkled pastel polo shirt and khaki golf shorts. Patricia was dressed in a loud patterned sundress and expensive sandals, her hair slightly disheveled from the wind. Cameron stood between them, sporting a fitted designer t-shirt and boat shoes, his face flushed with pure, unadulterated rage. They looked like they had just stepped off the 18th hole at their exclusive country club, not like a family attending an evening wedding reception. The blatant disrespect of their attire was a physical manifestation of how little they valued me and my special day. A collective murmur of confusion and stern disapproval rippled through the sea of formally dressed guests. David stopped speaking entirely, lowering his microphone as he stared at the intruders. He knew exactly who they were, even though he had only met them a handful of times during our relationship. His jaw clenched tightly, and he took a protective step closer to my chair. My parents and brother did not pause to take in the beautiful surroundings. They did not acknowledge the horrified stares of my new in-laws or the silent judgment of my professional colleagues. They completely bypassed the tables of bewildered guests and marched straight down the center aisle toward our head table. Their heavy footsteps echoed loudly on the polished marble floor, disrupting the stunned silence of the room. Patricia was leading the charge, her eyes locked onto me with a furious, entitled glare. I remained seated, my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting calmly on my lap. I refused to cower. I refused to let them see me sweat. When they reached the edge of the head table, they ignored David entirely. They treated my new husband as if he were completely invisible. Patricia slammed her expensive handbag down onto the pristine white tablecloth, knocking over a crystal water glass. The water spilled across the table, soaking the expensive linens and narrowly missing my bridal bouquet. "Turn the card back on right now," Patricia demanded, her voice loud, shrill, and echoing through the silent conservatory for everyone to hear. "You are ruining your brother's escrow." The guests gasped audibly. Some people in the front rows actually shifted in their seats, horrified by the spectacle unfolding before them. Cameron stepped forward, leaning aggressively over the table toward me. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing it was to sit in that title office and be told the funds bounced?" He spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You froze the account. You froze my money. Call the bank and authorize the wire transfer right this second, Lydia. The sellers are threatening to walk away, and I am not losing my dream lake house because you are throwing a childish tantrum on your wedding day." Richard crossed his arms over his chest, adopting his familiar patronizing stance. He looked at me with deep disappointment, the same look he used when I got a slightly lower grade on a high school exam. "Stop playing games, Lydia," he commanded sharply. "We can discuss your little grievances tomorrow. Right now, your brother has a real estate emergency. Fix what you broke." The sheer delusion of their demands was breathtaking. They had abandoned me on my wedding day, ignored my frantic calls, told me not to bother them, and now they had crashed my reception in golf clothes to demand $80,000. They firmly believed that my money was their money, and my sole purpose in life was to facilitate Cameron's unearned luxury. I looked at their angry, demanding faces. I felt no fear. I felt no intimidation. I only felt a deep, profound sense of finality. I stood up slowly, making sure my movements were deliberate and controlled. I turned to David, placing a gentle hand on his arm. He looked ready to physically throw my brother out of the venue himself. "Please," I said to David, keeping my voice low and steady. "Keep the guests distracted. Tell the band to start playing the dinner music again. I will handle this." David looked at me, his eyes full of concern, but he nodded. He trusted me completely. He raised the microphone and smoothly transitioned into a joke, thanking my eccentric family for their dramatic entrance and directing the guests' attention toward the catering staff bringing out the main courses. The string quartet cautiously resumed playing, filling the tense silence with upbeat classical music. I turned back to my family. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream or cry. I leaned forward slightly and spoke in a tone colder than ice. "We are not doing this here," I said. "Follow me into the hallway right now, or I will have the security team drag you out in front of 200 people. You have exactly 3 seconds to decide." My calm, icy demeanor caught them completely off guard. They were expecting me to fold under their pressure, to cry and apologize and beg for their approval, just like I had done my entire life. When I did not, Patricia hesitated, glancing nervously at the wealthy guests seated nearby who were openly glaring at her. Richard scowled, but nodded sharply toward the side exit. Cameron looked furious, but he turned on his heel and stomped toward the private corridor leading to the venue offices. I walked around the head table and followed them out, my long bridal train gliding silently across the marble floor. The moment the heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind us, sealing us inside the private soundproof hallway, the thin veneer of public restraint completely vanished. The verbal abuse escalated instantly, filling the narrow corridor with toxic noise. "You selfish, ungrateful brat!" Patricia hissed, her face turning an ugly shade of red as she stepped aggressively into my personal space. "How dare you pull a stunt like this today? We gave you life. We raised you. We sacrificed everything for you, and this is how you repay us. You leave your brother stranded at the closing table over a petty grudge." "It is not a grudge," I replied, my voice echoing clearly against the walls. "It is my money. It is the money I earned. You told me you needed that money to survive, to buy groceries, to pay medical bills. You cried and begged and lied to me for 4 years so you could secretly fund Cameron's luxury lifestyle." Richard stepped closer, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me into submission. "That money belongs to the family." He barked, his face contorted with anger. "You are a single part of this family, Lydia. Your brother needed financial backing to secure his property investment. We made a parental decision to allocate the resources where they were most needed. You have a highly successful software company. You have more than enough money. Cameron needed a little help to establish his empire. You are deliberately sabotaging his future out of pure spite and jealousy. Jealousy. I repeated, feeling a sharp bark of laughter escape my lips. You think I am jealous of a 36-year-old man who has not held a job in 5 years? You think I am jealous of someone who needs his parents to steal from his sister just to buy a house? Cameron lunged forward, stopping just inches from my face. Do not talk to them like that, he yelled, his breath smelling strongly of expensive scotch. You think you are so special because you built some stupid computer program? You owe us. You owe this family. You are going to open your phone right now. You are going to call your precious bank, and you are going to unfreeze that escrow money. If you do not, I promise you I will make your life a living hell. I will ruin this wedding. I will walk back out there and scream at your new husband and his stuck-up family until you do exactly what you are told. You cannot escape us, Lydia. You will always be beneath me. You are going to fix this escrow right now. I stared at Cameron's red, furious face, completely unfazed by his juvenile threats. Before I could respond, my father stepped forward, shifting his strategy from aggressive intimidation to deep, weaponized guilt. Lydia, look at your mother, Richard said, his voice lowering into a theatrical, trembling pitch designed to invoke shame. Look at what you are doing to her. We are your elderly parents. We raised you, fed you, and put clothes on your back when you were nothing. And now, on the day you should be honoring us, you are financially abusing us. You are leaving us destitute in our old age just to punish your brother. Destitute. I echoed the word, tasting vile on my tongue. I turned my gaze from Cameron to my parents. Let us talk about that, Dad. Let us talk about the financial abuse you just mentioned. 4 years ago, you sat in your living room and cried. You told me the market crashed. You told me your retirement portfolio was completely wiped out. Mom sobbed and said you could not afford your prescription medications or your weekly groceries. You begged me for help. I took a step closer to my father, refusing to let him look away. I lived in a 300-square-foot studio apartment. I ate canned soup for dinner every single night for 2 years. I wore shoes with holes in the soles so that I could send you $5,000 a month. I did it because I loved you. I did it because I thought you were starving. So tell me right now, looking me in the eye on my wedding day, why was my grocery money sitting in a title company escrow account for a luxury lake house? My mother had the decency to look momentarily uncomfortable, her eyes darting toward the floor. But Cameron did not possess a single shred of shame. Instead of looking guilty, my brother actually smiled. It was a slow, sickeningly smug smile that revealed the absolute rotten core of our family dynamic. Oh, stop being so dramatic, Cameron scoffed, rolling his eyes as he leaned against the hallway wall, crossing his arms casually. Nobody is starving, Lydia. Mom and Dad never lost their retirement. The hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees in temperature. I froze my eyes, snapping back to my brother. What did you just say? Cameron let out a short, arrogant laugh. I said they never lost their retirement. Dad's pension is perfectly fine. It has always been fine. Their investment portfolios are sitting exactly where they have always been, making steady returns. They just knew that if they asked you to fund my lifestyle directly, you would throw a massive fit about it. You always were so stingy with your money. He pushed himself off the wall, stepping closer to me with an air of absolute unearned superiority. Mom and Dad have been funneling your little monthly allowance directly to me for years. It was the easiest way to get you to contribute to this family without dealing with your relentless lectures. I have been trying to get my new venture off the ground, and I need a living situation that reflects my status. I deserve a house that matches my potential. You are just a software developer. I am a visionary. Mom and Dad understand that. They know I need the proper environment to network and build my empire. They were just reallocating family funds to the most deserving asset. I turned slowly to look at my parents. I expected them to deny it. I expected them to reprimand Cameron for revealing their massive multi-year deception. I even expected them to show a tiny fleeting glimpse of genuine remorse for stealing from me under the guise of medical emergencies. Instead, Patricia simply lifted her chin, looking at me with cold defiance. Your brother is right, Lydia. We did what we had to do for the good of the family. You have always been so terribly selfish with your success. You made millions from your software company, yet you never once offered to buy your brother a house. We had to secure his future somehow. It is a mother's job to ensure all her children are taken care of. You were providing for us and we were providing for Cameron. It is basic family economics. Basic family economics. I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerous icy whisper. You lied to me about starving. You committed emotional extortion. You used my love and my sense of duty to steal $60,000 a year from me, just so your lazy, unemployed 36-year-old son could play pretend millionaire. Do not speak about your brother that way. Richard snapped, his face reddening again. You will show some respect. Now you are going to take out your phone, you are going to call the bank manager, and you are going to release those funds to the title company immediately. Once the house closes, we can sweep this entire unfortunate misunderstanding under the rug and go back out there to enjoy the rest of the reception. If you do this quickly, we will even forgive you for the embarrassment you caused us earlier. They truly believed I would fold. They stood there in their golf clothes, having just confessed to a 4-year financial con, fully expecting me to bow my head, apologize for my insolence, and hand over $80,000 so they could go back to eating my catered food and drinking my expensive champagne. They viewed me not as a human being, not as a daughter, and certainly not as a bride on her wedding day. They viewed me strictly as their personal automated teller machine. A machine that was currently malfunctioning and simply needed to be hit a few times until it dispensed the cash they felt entitled to. The last remaining thread of my familial obligations snapped. It did not break with a loud, dramatic noise. It simply dissolved into nothingness, leaving behind a profound, absolute clarity. You are right, I said quietly, my voice devoid of any emotion. There has been a massive misunderstanding. The misunderstanding was me believing that I actually had a family. I raised my hand and caught the eye of the venue head of security, a large, broad-shouldered man named Braddock, who had been hovering discreetly at the far end of the hallway. David and I had specifically briefed the security team about my family's unpredictable nature during the planning process, instructing them to stay vigilant. I gave Braddock a single sharp nod. Immediately, Braddock and 3 other heavily built security guards stepped into the corridor, moving with swift professional purpose. Excuse me, folks, Braddock said, his voice deep and authoritative, as he stepped between me and my father. You need to leave the premises immediately. You are not on the approved guest list, and the bride has requested your departure. Patricia gasped loudly, clutching her designer handbag to her chest, as if she had just been physically struck. How dare you? We are her parents. We are the parents of the bride. You cannot throw us out. Ma'am, please step toward the exit, one of the other guards said, placing a firm, unyielding hand on Richard's shoulder. Richard violently shoved the guard's hand away, his face turning purple with outrage. Do not touch me. Lydia, call off these rent-a-cops right now. This is completely unacceptable behavior. You are making a massive mistake. The only mistake I made was letting you drain my bank account for 4 years, I replied, crossing my arms and taking a step back, allowing the security team to form a solid wall between us. Escort them out. If they resist, call the Chicago police and have them arrested for trespassing. Cameron's smug demeanor vanished instantly, replaced by wide-eyed, frantic panic as 2 guards grabbed him by the arms. He thrashed against their grip, his boat shoes slipping on the polished marble floor as they began to physically drag him down the hallway toward the service exit. Get your hands off me. Do you know who I am? I am a VIP. Let me go. You are an unemployed scam artist, I said calmly, watching him struggle. And your escrow is officially dead. Patricia began to shriek, a high-pitched theatrical wail that echoed off the high ceilings as a guard gently but firmly guided her toward the door. You are an awful daughter. You will regret this, Lydia. We will never forgive you for this. The feeling is entirely mutual, I stated, not blinking, as she was pushed through the heavy exit doors into the warm summer night. Richard was the last to be pushed out, cursing loudly and threatening to sue the venue, the security team, and me. But it was Cameron who fought the hardest. As the guards managed to wrangle him out the door, forcing him backward onto the paved concrete of the venue loading dock, he dug his heels in. He managed to pry one arm free for just a second, pointing that same trembling, furious finger directly at me through the gap in the closing doors. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged malice. "You think closing that account stops me?" Cameron shouted at the top of his lungs, his voice scraping raw with desperation and rage. "You think you can just cut us off and walk away? You have no idea what is coming for you. Wait until Monday, you selfish brat! Wait until Monday!" The heavy metal service doors slammed shut with a definitive echoing thud, cutting off his frantic screaming and sealing them outside in the dark alleyway. I stood in the quiet hallway for a long moment, the silence rushing back in to fill the space they had polluted. The threat hung heavily in the air. Wait until Monday. It sounded like the desperate, empty rambling of an angry man who had just lost his free ride. I smoothed the skirt of my wedding dress, turned my back on the exit doors, and walked proudly back into my reception to dance with my husband. I had absolutely no idea that Cameron's parting threat was not an empty bluff, but a promise of a financial nightmare that was already ticking down like a bomb. The tropical air of Costa Rica was thick with the sweet scent of blooming hibiscus and salt from the nearby ocean. David had spared absolutely no expense for our brief 4-day honeymoon, booking a spectacular secluded cliffside villa that offered a panoramic view of the sparkling turquoise waters below. It was an architectural masterpiece of glass and polished wood, designed specifically to isolate its guests from the chaotic demands of the outside world. We were supposed to be unplugged, unwinding from the massive stress of the wedding planning and basking in the warm, quiet glow of our new marriage. David was currently doing exactly that. I could hear him humming happily from the outdoor terrace as he prepared fresh local coffee, his relaxed demeanor a testament to his ability to leave work at the door. I, however, was trapped in a mental prison entirely of my own making. I sat on the edge of our massive canopy bed, the luxurious silk sheets cool against my skin, but my blood was running hot with an unshakable creeping anxiety. I could not stop hearing the exact cadence of my brother's voice echoing in the quiet room. I closed my eyes and the memory played on a continuous, inescapable loop. I saw Cameron being physically dragged backward through the heavy wooden service doors of the botanical garden. I saw the veins bulging in his neck, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged malice. I heard the sharp, desperate gravel in his throat as he screamed his final threat. "Wait until Monday, you selfish brat! Wait until Monday!" It was currently Sunday morning. In less than 24 hours, whatever financial landmine Cameron had planted was scheduled to detonate. I had spent the entirety of our first-class flight trying to rationalize his outburst. I told myself it was just the pathetic, empty rambling of an angry, deeply entitled man who had just lost his free ride. Cameron was notoriously incompetent. He lacked the basic discipline required to maintain a standard 9-to-5 job, let inflation adjust his lifestyle, or successfully launch any of his half-baked business ventures. He was a master manipulator of my parents, yes, but he was not a criminal mastermind. He did not possess the technical skills or the financial acumen to breach my corporate accounts or hack into my heavily encrypted personal assets. My software company was protected by the most advanced security protocols on the market. My personal wealth was shielded behind layers of limited liability companies and fiercely guarded trusts. I was completely bulletproof, yet the cold knot of dread in my stomach refused to dissolve. Cameron had been too specific. He did not say, "I will get you for this," or "I will make you pay." He named a specific day. Monday. Monday is when the banks open. Monday is when wire transfers clear. Monday is when corporate financial institutions execute high-level legal mandates. He was waiting for the start of the business week. I picked up my phone from the nightstand. I had promised David I would keep it on airplane mode, but the sheer weight of the suspense was eating me alive. I turned off the airplane mode setting, ignoring the immediate flood of unread emails and generic notifications. I opened my social media applications. I did not want to look at my parents' accounts. They were likely just posting carefully curated, deeply fabricated stories about my wedding to save face with their country club friends. Instead, I navigated straight to the public profile of my sister-in-law, Whitney. If Cameron was the golden child, Whitney was his perfectly matched materialistic counterpart. She was a woman whose entire personality was constructed around the relentless pursuit of perceived status. She had not worked a single day since marrying my brother 4 years ago, proudly claiming she was meant for the soft life of a dedicated homemaker, despite the fact that they had no children and lived in a condo that my parents subsidized. Her social media was a heavily filtered, aggressively branded monument to her own vanity. I scrolled past her recent posts, my eyes narrowing as I analyzed the digital footprint of their daily lives. I expected to see the usual pretentious displays, perhaps a nice dinner out, or a weekend trip to a local vineyard. What I saw instead made the breath catch painfully in my throat. The most recent photo, posted just 3 days before my wedding, featured Whitney leaning casually against the hood of a brand new matte black Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon. The vehicle was parked in the driveway of a massive, stunning lakefront property. She was wearing a perfectly tailored designer summer dress, holding a glass of champagne, and flashing a brilliant, triumphant smile at the camera. Over her shoulder hung a Hermes Birkin bag, an exclusive accessory that required an immense purchase history just to be offered the opportunity to buy it. I tapped on the photo to read the caption. It was written with her signature blend of toxic positivity and aggressive bragging. Closing day on our dream sanctuary. God is so good. Blessed to have family who invests in our empire, making power moves and building generational wealth. I stared at the words, reading them over and over until the letters began to blur together on the glowing screen. Blessed to have family who invests in our empire. A sudden dizzying wave of nausea washed over me. I sat up straighter, my mind immediately shifting into the ruthless analytical mode I used when balancing corporate budgets and projecting software revenue streams. I began to do the math. For the past 4 years, I had been sending my parents exactly $5,000 on the first of every single month. That equated to $60,000 a year. Over the course of 4 years, I had transferred a grand total of $240,000 into their joint account. It was a substantial amount of money, certainly enough to help an elderly couple comfortably cover their groceries, utility bills, and basic medical expenses. It was also enough for my parents to secretly funnel cash to Cameron to pay his rent and cover his basic living costs so he did not have to work a normal job. But it was absolutely unequivocally not enough money to fund the lifestyle staring back at me from Whitney's social media feed. A Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon of that specific model and trim package retailed for at least $150,000. The Birkin bag slung casually over her shoulder cost a minimum of $20,000 on the resale market, assuming she did not buy it directly from the boutique. The lake house they were standing in front of the very same property that caused them to miss my wedding. When the escrow fell through, was located in an exclusive, highly sought-after zip code. A down payment on a house of that magnitude would require at least $100,000 in liquid cash, not to mention the extensive proof of income required to secure the mortgage. I scrolled further down her page, my heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. I saw photos from a recent vacation to Dubai featuring first-class airline tickets and a suite at a 7-star hotel. I saw posts documenting private omakase dinners that cost $500 a plate. I saw a closet tour video highlighting rows of red-bottomed shoes, diamond tennis bracelets, and custom-tailored suits for Cameron. $60,000 a year could not even cover the taxes and insurance on their displayed lifestyle. It could barely cover Whitney's shopping habits for a single fiscal quarter. My mind raced desperately, trying to construct a logical explanation. Did my parents have a massive hidden fortune they had never told me about? No, that was impossible. I knew their financial history intimately. Before they claimed their retirement was wiped out, I had seen their portfolio. My father had been a mid-level manager at an insurance firm, and my mother was a part-time real estate agent who rarely closed a sale. They had a comfortable middle-class existence, a decent pension, and some modest investments. They owned their suburban home outright, but they were absolutely not multi-millionaires capable of bankrolling a life of private jets, exotic cars, and luxury lake houses for their unemployed son. If my $5,000 a month was just a drop in the bucket, where was the rest of the ocean coming from? The caption glared at me, taunting me with its arrogant phrasing. Blessed to have family who invests in our empire. Invests. The word echoed in my mind, sharp and ominous. She did not say family who helps us out. She did not say family who supports us. She used a specific corporate term. She used the word invests. A cold, creeping horror began to spread through my chest, freezing the blood in my veins. The puzzle pieces were floating in the air, disjointed and terrifying, waiting to snap into a picture I did not want to see. Cameron and Whitney were spending millions of dollars they did not earn. My parents were facilitating the transactions, funneling my allowance to them to cover the gaps. But my allowance was not the primary source of their wealth. My parents did not possess that kind of capital either. There was a massive gaping hole in the financial calculus, a massive influx of capital that had to be coming from somewhere, and Cameron had pointed his finger directly at my face, threatening me with the arrival of Monday morning. He did not act like a man who had merely lost a $5,000 allowance. He acted like a man whose entire corporate structure was about to collapse because the primary foundational pillar had just shifted. He was not threatening to call me and yell at me. He was not threatening to ruin my reputation with family gossip. He was threatening me with a systemic institutional consequence. Wait until Monday. The realization hit me with the devastating force of a physical blow. The money was not coming from my parents' savings. The money was not coming from a secret lottery winning. The money was somehow in some impossible catastrophic way coming from me. I was tied to this. I was tethered to their empire. I did not know how they bypassed my firewalls. I did not know what legal loopholes they had exploited or what documents they had manipulated behind my back. But the absolute certainty of my financial exposure settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I dropped the phone onto the silk sheets, my hands trembling uncontrollably. The serene, beautiful sounds of the Costa Rican jungle outside my window faded into a dull, meaningless buzz. The honeymoon was over before it had even truly begun. There would be no relaxing on the beach. There would be no unplugging from the world. I was standing on the edge of a massive, invisible precipice, and my brother was holding the detonator, waiting for the banks to open on Monday morning. I told David to pack his bags. There was no discussion, no hesitation, and absolutely no pushback from the man I had just married. He saw the sheer terror mixed with absolute calculating rage in my eyes, and simply started throwing our clothes back into the suitcases. We left the cliffside Costa Rican villa before the sun even finished rising over the ocean. We abandoned the pristine beaches and the luxury honeymoon I had paid for because my survival instincts were screaming at a deafening volume. By Monday morning, we were touching down at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. I did not go home to unpack. I did not go to my corporate office to check on my software company. I went straight to the towering glass and steel skyscraper in downtown Chicago that housed the most ruthless asset protection law firm in the Midwest. I walked into the massive mahogany conference room and dropped my encrypted laptop onto the polished table. Sitting across from me were two men who commanded exorbitant hourly rates because they specialized in financial warfare. Harrison was a corporate defense attorney known for destroying hostile takeover attempts and dismantling fraudulent claims with clinical precision. Sitting next to him was Mitchell, a forensic accountant who could track a single missing dollar through a dozen offshore shell companies. I did not waste time with pleasantries or tearful family background stories. I slid my access codes across the table and told them I needed a comprehensive microscopic audit of every single financial interaction I had ever had with my parents. I told them to tear my financial history apart down to the last decimal point and find out exactly how my unemployed brother was living like a tech billionaire. The audit began immediately. Mitchell connected his systems to my historical banking records, cross-referencing public property databases, tax filings, and corporate registries. The silence in the conference room was heavy, broken only by the rapid clicking of keyboards and the low hum of the city traffic outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. As I sat there watching the financial experts dissect my family history, the bitter memories of my childhood flooded back, validating every suspicion I currently held. Growing up, the dynamic in our household was sickeningly clear. Cameron was praised relentlessly for the absolute bare minimum, while my exceptional achievements were treated as an annoying inconvenience. I distinctly remembered the day Cameron brought home a C- on a remedial business midterm during his sophomore year of college. My parents threw him a celebratory steak dinner praising his entrepreneurial spirit and telling everyone he was just too visionary for traditional grading systems. That exact same week, I brought home a straight A report card and an acceptance letter for a full academic scholarship. My mother barely glanced at the prestigious letter before telling me to put it away and stop being such a show-off because I was making my brother feel bad about his own journey. That toxic dynamic had only amplified in adulthood. Over the last decade, Cameron had launched 4 separate disastrous startup companies. He created a premium dog walking application that crashed within a month. He started a boutique consulting firm with no actual clients. He opened a luxury lifestyle brand that produced nothing but debt. Each and every time his businesses spectacularly imploded, my parents were right there to catch him, shielding him from the brutal reality of his own incompetence. They funded his failures while simultaneously demanding that I subsidize their basic living expenses. 2 hours into the investigation, Mitchell suddenly let out a low, sharp whistle. He pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose and turned his monitor toward me and Harrison. He had uncovered the very first layer of my parents' massive financial web. It turns out my parents were not just funneling my $5,000 monthly allowance to Cameron. They had actively leveraged their own future to keep his delusions afloat. Mitchell pulled up the county property records for my parents' pristine suburban home. The house they had owned free and clear for 10 years was no longer fully theirs. 3 years ago, Richard and Patricia had marched into a bank and mortgaged their paid-off property to the absolute maximum limit. They took out a staggering $400,000 home equity line of credit. They bled the equity of their own house dry, draining 4 decades of their own hard work just to inject liquid cash into Cameron's failing corporate entities. I stared at the screen, tracing the digital paper trail of the massive loan. The money had been pulled from the bank and immediately dumped into Cameron's accounts, keeping him afloat while he played pretend CEO. It was a pathetic, desperate move by 2 parents who could not accept that their golden child was a complete financial liability. They had risked their own roof to buy him time. But the cold, analytical part of my brain immediately began running the numbers, and a chilling realization washed over me. I looked at Mitchell and shook my head. "This is not the whole picture," I said, my voice sounding surprisingly steady, despite the roaring in my ears. I saw my sister-in-law posting pictures of a brand-new matte black Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon. I saw the massive lake house property they just tried to close on. I saw the first-class flights to Dubai and the $20,000 designer handbags. $400,000 from a home equity loan does not cover that lifestyle. That money barely covers the debts from Cameron's previous corporate bankruptcies. If they used the home equity line to pay off his old creditors, they would have nothing left for his current spending spree. The math still does not add up to what he is spending right now. There is a massive piece of capital missing. Mitchell nodded in agreement, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he dug deeper into the obscure corporate registries and cross-referenced Cameron's current active business licenses. He knew the numbers did not balance. You do not buy million-dollar lake houses and 6-figure luxury vehicles on the remaining scraps of a suburban home equity loan. There had to be a massive influx of institutional capital. A bank or a private equity firm had to be lending Cameron millions of dollars. But no legitimate financial institution would ever lend that kind of money to a man with 4 bankruptcies and 0 verifiable income unless he had an absolutely bulletproof guarantor backing the play. Harrison stood up from the table, his expression darkening. He excused himself from the conference room, stepping into his private glass-walled office to make a series of high-priority phone calls to his contacts in the commercial banking sector. I sat at the table with Mitchell drinking lukewarm black coffee and watching the digital records continue to populate on the monitors. Every minute that passed felt like an hour. The ticking of the wall clock echoed the frantic beating of my heart. I knew deep down that my parents had done something unforgivable, but my mind simply could not fathom the mechanics of their betrayal. I had protected my software company with layers of legal armor. I was careful. I was meticulous. I never co-signed a single loan for anyone in my family. Suddenly, the heavy glass door of the conference room swung open. Harrison walked back in, and the atmosphere in the room plummeted to sub-zero temperatures. He did not look like a highly paid lawyer who had just found a minor accounting error or a simple tax discrepancy. He looked like a man who had just uncovered a live grenade sitting directly under my chair. He walked slowly toward the table, holding a single printed document he had just received via secure fax from a commercial lending institution. His face was completely drained of color, his jaw set in a rigid, unyielding line. He did not say a word as he reached the table. He simply slid the piece of paper across the polished mahogany surface, stopping right in front of me. Lydia Harrison said, his voice gravely and devoid of any professional detachment. "We found the missing money. We found out exactly how your brother secured the funding for his current lifestyle. You need to look at this very carefully." I looked down at the document. It was a commercial corporate lending agreement. It was a contract for a massive high-risk business loan issued to Cameron's newest corporate entity. I scanned the staggering principal amount and the predatory interest rates. But it was not the numbers that made my breath catch in my throat. It was the bottom of the final page. There, staring back at me in stark black and white, was a section designating the corporate guarantor for the multi-million-dollar debt. The guarantor listed was my software company, and right on the signature line securing the massive liability against everything I had built was my own signature. I stared at the ink. I stared at the looping letters of my name. I had never seen this document in my life, but the signature was there, perfectly authorizing the destruction of my entire world. I looked at the paper, and my blood ran completely cold. The signature at the bottom of the page was a flawless, terrifying replication of my own handwriting. Every loop, every sharp angle, every specific pressure point had been painstakingly practiced and perfectly executed. But it was a complete fabrication. I traced my finger over the black ink, feeling a profound sense of violation radiating through my chest. This was not a simple misunderstanding or a desperate parental mistake. This was a highly calculated, deliberate act of corporate identity theft. Harrison stood by the mahogany table watching my face carefully. He knew exactly what this document represented. "This is not a personal loan, Lydia," he explained, his voice dead serious. "This is a corporate guarantor agreement. The commercial bank did not lend your brother millions of dollars based on his non-existent credit history or his string of failed startups. They lent him the capital because this document legally binds your software company to the entire debt. Your parents offered up your entire corporate entity as the ultimate collateral." I stared at the staggering principal amount printed on the first page. It was a multi-million-dollar commercial note tied directly to a new limited liability company Cameron had recently registered. He was using this massive influx of cash to buy the Lake House Fund, the matte black Mercedes-Benz, and pay for Whitney's absurd luxury shopping sprees. His entire empire was a complete mirage built entirely on my stolen credibility. "How did they even accomplish this?" I demanded, looking up at Mitchell and Harrison. "My company operates behind ironclad legal firewalls. My board of directors would have to approve a corporate guarantee of this magnitude. My parents have absolutely no legal authority within my software enterprise. How did a commercial bank approve this without speaking to me directly?" Mitchell pulled up a series of archived documents on his monitor. It took them a minute to trace the exact lineage of the fraud, but the digital paper trail was undeniable. 3 years ago, I had briefly made my parents temporary trustees on an old dormant limited liability company to manage a minor real estate tax transfer while I was out of the country securing seed funding for my main software business. It was a temporary administrative convenience meant to last exactly 30 days. They used that 30-day window, Mitchell explained, pointing to a scanned resolution document on his glowing screen. They used their temporary trustee status on the old dormant company to establish a line of communication with a junior commercial lending officer. They presented themselves as your authorized financial representatives. Then they layered the deception. They used your personal identification information, which they obviously possessed as your parents, to bypass the initial identity verification protocols. From there, they fabricated a series of board resolutions and forged your signature on the final guarantor contract. The bank officer eager to close a massive commercial loan with a highly successful tech founder pushed the paperwork through underwriting without conducting the mandatory secondary verbal verification. The sheer audacity of the crime was breathtaking. Richard and Patricia had weaponized my trust, committing federal wire fraud and identity theft to secure a golden ticket for their favorite child. They had handed Cameron the keys to my kingdom while looking me in the eye and crying about their inability to afford groceries. Harrison leaned forward, placing both hands on the table. The legal implications here are catastrophic, Lydia. We have reviewed Cameron's current business filings. He is burning through this capital at an unsustainable rate. He has no viable product, no actual clients, and massive overhead costs. His company is a textbook shell game operating at a staggering loss. It is only a matter of time before he completely defaults on this commercial loan. The room fell dead silent as Harrison outlined the nightmare scenario. When Cameron defaults, the bank is going to initiate immediate aggressive collection protocols. They will seize his assets first, but those are mostly rapidly depreciating luxury vehicles and a heavily mortgaged lake house. When that falls short of covering the multi-million-dollar principal, they are going to trigger the guarantor clause. They are going to come directly for your software company. They can freeze your corporate operating accounts, seize your intellectual property, and liquidate your assets to satisfy your brother's debt. Your employees could lose their jobs. Your investors could lose their equity. Your entire life's work is currently sitting on the chopping block because your parents decided your success belonged to Cameron. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, taking a slow, deliberate breath. The scared, rejected daughter inside me, the one who had sent $5,000 a month just to buy a scrap of parental affection, was officially dead and buried. The woman sitting in that conference room was a chief executive officer who was about to go to war. I opened my eyes and looked directly at Harrison. I felt no sorrow for my parents. I felt no lingering familial obligation. I only felt a ruthless, burning desire to burn their false empire to the ground. "What is our immediate countermeasure?" I asked, my tone completely devoid of fear. "I want this dismantled right now." Harrison smiled, a sharp, predatory expression that justified his exorbitant billing rate. "We go on the offensive immediately," he said. "We do not wait for the bank to realize Cameron is a fraud, and we certainly do not wait for your brother to default. We blow the whistle ourselves." I nodded sharply. "Do it. Call them right now." Harrison pulled his secure phone from his pocket and placed it on the center of the conference table, activating the speakerphone. He dialed the direct line for the Executive Fraud Investigation Department of the commercial lending institution that held Cameron's loan. He bypassed the junior officers and the customer service representatives, demanding immediate connection to the senior vice president of risk management. When the executive finally answered, Harrison did not mince words. He introduced himself as the lead asset protection counsel for my software corporation. He systematically and brutally laid out the entire situation. He informed the bank that they were currently holding a fraudulent multi-million-dollar commercial note secured by a forged guarantor agreement. He provided the exact tracking numbers of the falsified board resolutions and explicitly named Richard and Patricia as the perpetrators of identity theft. The bank executive on the other end of the line went completely silent, his professional demeanor instantly fracturing into genuine panic. A fraudulent commercial loan of that magnitude, backed by a major tech company, was a catastrophic compliance failure that could cost people their careers and trigger massive federal penalties. "We are initiating a formal contest of the signature immediately," Harrison stated, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "My client is officially filing a declaration of forgery. We demand an immediate freeze on all remaining funds associated with Cameron's corporate accounts. Furthermore, we expect your institution to launch a full internal investigation into the underwriting officer who approved this fraudulent transaction without proper secondary verification." The bank executive scrambled to assure Harrison that their elite fraud department would instantly lock down the accounts and begin an aggressive review of the loan origination documents. The panic in his voice was palpable as he realized the sheer scale of the liability his institution had just absorbed. But Harrison was not finished turning the screws. "To be absolutely clear," Harrison continued, leaning closer to the phone speaker, "my client bears zero financial liability for this debt. We are currently drafting the formal affidavits of forgery to submit to the federal authorities. We are escalating this to a federal wire fraud and identity theft investigation. Your institution will need to direct all future collection efforts toward the actual perpetrators of this crime. Richard and Patricia have significant equity tied up in their primary residence, which they clearly leveraged as part of this broader financial conspiracy. I highly suggest your recovery team focuses their attention there, because if your bank attempts to place a single lien on my client's software company, we will bury you in litigation so deep you will never see the sun again." The call ended with the bank executive promising immediate sweeping action and begging for our full cooperation with their internal fraud team. I sat back in my leather chair watching Mitchell compile the final pieces of the forensic accounting report. The trap was officially set, and the bank was about to descend upon Cameron's fake empire with the full, devastating force of a multi-billion-dollar financial institution trying to cover its own massive mistakes. My parents thought they could steal my credibility in the dark and use it to fund their golden child's delusions. They severely underestimated what happens when you force a self-made woman to protect her own legacy. The bank was coming for them. The federal authorities were coming for them. And I was going to sit back and watch as they lost absolutely everything they had stolen from me. The immediate aftermath of our meeting with Harrison and Mitchell brought a strange, heavy silence. For exactly 4 days after the commercial bank initiated their fraud protocols and froze Cameron's corporate accounts, my phone did not ring a single time. My parents and my brother had gone completely radio silent. I knew this was not a surrender. Toxic people never surrender when their primary source of funding is severed. This was a tactical retreat. They were regrouping, licking their wounds, and desperately trying to figure out how to regain control of a narrative that was rapidly slipping through their fingers. They knew they could no longer intimidate me directly. I had stared them down at my wedding reception and unleashed a legal strike force that terrified them. Since direct confrontation had failed spectacularly, they resorted to their favorite secondary tactic. They deployed their flying monkeys. Patricia and Richard launched a vicious, highly coordinated, preemptive smear campaign across our entire extended family. They knew that if the truth about their financial crimes came to light, their pristine social standing would be instantly vaporized. To prevent that, they had to strike first. They had to control the story before I could expose them. They needed to paint themselves as the ultimate victims and cast me as the cruel, heartless villain who had destroyed her own family out of pure spite. The digital assault began on a Thursday morning. It started as a slow trickle of confused messages from distant cousins and rapidly escalated into an avalanche of vitriol from my aunts and uncles. My phone essentially turned into a glowing brick of hatred, vibrating constantly with text messages, missed calls, and lengthy unhinged voicemails. I sat at my kitchen island with David sipping black coffee and watching the notifications stack up on my locked screen. My parents had clearly spent the last 4 days making tearful, agonizing phone calls to every single branch of the family tree, spinning a masterclass of absolute fiction. According to the narrative my mother had carefully constructed, the $80,000 I had transferred out of the joint account was not my money at all. Patricia told the entire extended family that she and Richard had been saving that money for decades. She claimed it was their absolute last safety net, their ultimate retirement fund. She wept on the phone to her sisters, claiming that I had used my technical skills to hack into their accounts and steal their life savings just to pay for my lavish botanical garden wedding. She completely omitted the fact that I had been depositing $5,000 a month into that account for 4 years. She conveniently left out the detail that the money was sitting in an escrow account for Cameron's luxury lake house. Instead, she painted a heartbreaking picture of two elderly, loving parents who had been robbed blind by their own daughter and left entirely destitute. The extended family, who had always viewed my parents as the generous, upstanding pillars of our community, swallowed the lies without a single drop of hesitation. They did not call me to ask for my side of the story. They did not request clarification. They simply armed themselves with righteous indignation and marched to war on my mother's behalf. I unlocked my phone and opened my messages, reading the venomous words sent by people who had smiled at me and eaten my catered food just weeks prior. My Uncle Robert, my father's older brother, sent a massive paragraph accusing me of elder abuse. He called me a narcissistic, greedy tech snob who had lost touch with basic human decency. He wrote that my success had poisoned my soul and that leaving my poor loving parents destitute to pay for a lavish wedding was a sin I would answer for one day. My cousin Brittany, who had always been incredibly jealous of my software company, sent a barrage of direct messages on social media. She called me a monster. She said I was dead to the family and that David should be ashamed to have married someone so financially abusive. She threatened to post my actions on a public forum to warn my clients about my lack of ethics. The voicemails were even worse. I tapped play on a 3-minute audio message from my Aunt Diane, my mother's younger sister. Her voice was shaking with theatrical rage. She screamed into the receiver, demanding that I wire the stolen money back to my parents immediately. She sobbed, saying my mother was having panic attacks about becoming homeless because of my greed. She claimed Cameron was stepping up, sacrificing his own business ventures just to help his parents pay rent, framing my fraudulent brother as the ultimate savior of the family. I listened to Aunt Diane's weeping voice echoing in my quiet kitchen. The level of manipulation was truly breathtaking. Richard and Patricia had successfully weaponized the entire family structure against me. They had created a massive echo chamber of guilt, shame, and outrage, fully expecting me to crack under the overwhelming societal pressure. They firmly believed that if enough people called me a monster, I would break down, beg for forgiveness, and withdraw the fraud allegations at the bank to restore my reputation. They thought I would trade my financial security for their twisted version of family peace. David reached across the kitchen island and gently placed his hand over mine. He looked at the glowing screen of my phone, reading the horrible messages from my relatives, his jaw tight with barely suppressed anger. He asked me if I wanted him to call Uncle Robert and set the record straight. He offered to draft a mass email to the entire family, outlining the exact truth about the stolen $5,000 a month and the forged commercial loan documents. I shook my head slowly, locking the phone and pushing it away. I told David we were not going to do anything. I refused to justify my existence to people who were so eager to believe the absolute worst about me. I refused to engage in a messy public screaming match over text messages. Defending myself right now would only make me look guilty. It would make me look defensive and frantic. When you are holding a royal flush, you do not need to flip the table and scream about your cards. You just sit back, maintain absolute silence, and let the other players push all their chips into the center of the table. I ignored every single message. I let the calls go directly to voicemail. I did not block their numbers because I wanted to collect every vicious text and every unhinged audio recording. I treated their hatred as data gathering. Every lie they put into writing was just another piece of evidence demonstrating exactly how far my parents were willing to go to cover up their federal crimes. The silence from my end drove them absolutely crazy. Without my reaction to feed on their smear campaign started to burn out of control. They became more aggressive, more dramatic, and entirely reckless with their accusations. I simply went to work, grew my software company, and enjoyed my peaceful new marriage with David completely untethered from their toxic chaos. Weeks passed, and the crisp autumn air signaled the approach of the holiday season. The bank investigation was moving forward quietly but aggressively behind the scenes. Harrison assured me that the commercial lending institution was building an airtight case against Cameron, carefully gathering the forged documents and preparing to execute the liens on my parents' property. The hammer was going to fall, but the legal system required patience. In early November, my phone rang with a call from Aunt Diane. I let it go to voicemail, expecting another screaming lecture about my profound selfishness. When I listened to the message later that evening, I was surprised to hear a completely different tone. The screaming rage was gone. In its place was a sickly sweet, heavily manipulated tone of maternal concern. Aunt Diane was playing the role of the benevolent peacekeeper. She followed up the voicemail with a lengthy, carefully worded email. She wrote that the family was hurting, that the current rift was causing too much pain for everyone involved, and that life was simply too short to hold on to bitter grudges. She acknowledged that mistakes had been made on both sides, a classic manipulation tactic designed to distribute my parents' guilt onto my shoulders. Then she delivered the main objective of her communication. She formally invited David and me to her house for Thanksgiving dinner. Aunt Diane promised that this would be a peaceful, neutral family gathering. She assured me that there would be no shouting, no demands, and no hostility. She framed the dinner as an opportunity to sit down, like reasonable adults, break bread and hash things out in a safe environment. She claimed my parents were ready to talk and that Cameron wanted to clear the air so we could all move forward as a united front. I stared at the email on my laptop screen, reading between the carefully constructed lines of false diplomacy. I knew exactly what this was. This was not an olive branch. This was not a genuine attempt at family healing or a safe space for open communication. This was a highly coordinated, premeditated trap. My parents realized that the smear campaign had failed to force my compliance. They realized that sending angry relatives to harass my phone was not going to make me unfreeze the escrow funds or drop the bank investigation. Since long-distance intimidation had proven completely ineffective, they needed to get me into a room where they could exert maximum physical and psychological pressure. They needed a controlled environment where the entire extended family could gang up on me, corner me at a dining room table, and socially engineer my surrender. Aunt Diane's house was the perfect venue for an ambush. David read the email over my shoulder, scoffing loudly at the phrase peaceful, neutral family gathering. He told me it was a terrible idea. He said walking into that house would be like walking straight into a den of hungry wolves. He suggested we book a flight to Denver and spend a quiet, drama-free Thanksgiving with his parents instead. I looked at David, a slow, calculated smile spreading across my face. I told him he was absolutely right about the wolves. I knew they were planning to corner me. I knew they were going to use the holiday as a weapon to demand money, demand apologies, and force me back into my designated role as the family scapegoat. They thought they had the upper hand because they controlled the guest list and the narrative. But what they did not know was that I possessed the finalized forensic accounting report from Mitchell. What they did not know was that I had hard, undeniable proof of their wire fraud, their identity theft, and their massive financial deception. They wanted a public audience to force my submission. I realized that an audience was exactly what I needed to execute their total destruction. I opened my email client, clicked reply to Aunt Diane's message, and kept my response incredibly brief. I typed that David and I would be delighted to attend the holiday dinner. I told her I agreed that it was finally time to put everything out on the table and reveal the whole truth so the family could heal. I hit send, locking in my attendance. I knew it was a trap, but I accepted it anyway because I had my own trap to spring, and I was going to serve it to them on a silver platter. The drive to Aunt Diane's house took 45 minutes, but the suffocating tension inside the car made it feel like an absolute eternity. David kept his right hand firmly draped over mine, his thumb drawing slow, soothing circles across my knuckles. We pulled into the sprawling, perfectly manicured circular driveway of my aunt's massive suburban estate. High-end luxury cars lined the perimeter, signaling that the entire extended family had already arrived for this highly anticipated holiday gathering. I stepped out of the vehicle into the crisp, biting autumn air. I adjusted the collar of my tailored wool coat and grabbed my heavy leather tote bag from the back seat. That bag contained a thick, legally bound folder that was about to turn this family Thanksgiving into a literal crime scene investigation. I took a deep breath, feeling a surge of adrenaline mixing with cold, absolute determination. We walked up the brick pathway and David rang the doorbell. My cousin Greg opened the heavy oak door. His usual warm, jovial greeting was completely absent. Instead, he gave me a tight, unsmiling nod, stepping aside to let us enter without saying a single word. The hostility in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. As we walked into the grand foyer, the ambient chatter from the adjacent rooms immediately died down. I could feel dozens of eyes locking onto me. Aunts, uncles, and cousins stood in small clusters, holding glasses of wine, glaring at me with unfiltered disdain. Nobody stepped forward to hug me. Nobody offered to take our coats. We were pariahs walking straight into the lion's den, just as David had predicted. Aunt Diane emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a decorative linen apron. She offered me a stiff, painfully fake smile that did not reach her eyes. She gestured toward the formal dining room, instructing us to take our seats, because they were just about to begin. David and I walked into the dining room, and the sheer audacity of the seating arrangement nearly made me laugh out loud. The massive mahogany table was set for 30 people, adorned with extravagant floral centerpieces and expensive crystal glasses. Silver platters waiting for food gleamed under the warm light of the crystal chandelier. But it was the head of the table that drew my immediate razor-sharp focus. Sitting there holding court like absolute royalty were Richard, Patricia, Cameron, and Whitney. They were positioned at the very center of the room, flanked by my most judgmental relatives, forming an impenetrable wall of self-righteous authority. Patricia was wearing a dark, somber dress, playing the role of the grieving, destitute mother to absolute perfection. Richard sat with his shoulders slumped, clutching a glass of bourbon, projecting the carefully crafted image of a broken, betrayed patriarch. Cameron and Whitney sat beside them, whispering to each other and casting arrogant, sneering glances in my direction. Whitney was literally wearing a diamond tennis bracelet that my stolen money had undoubtedly financed, yet she had the nerve to look at me with profound pity. They had orchestrated this entire visual tableau to maximize their victimhood and solidify their absolute control over the family narrative. They were daring me to challenge their manufactured reality in front of an audience they had already brainwashed. Aunt Diane directed David and me to two empty chairs at the very far end of the table, isolating us entirely from the rest of the group. We sat down, our backs almost pressed against the dining room wall. The silence in the room grew heavier, suffocating, and incredibly deliberate. No food was being served. The lavish Thanksgiving turkey remained hidden in the kitchen. This was not a holiday dinner. This was a hostile tribunal, and I was the sole defendant placed on trial for crimes I did not commit. Aunt Diane took her place, standing at the opposite end of the long table right next to my weeping mother. She picked up a silver spoon and tapped it gently against her crystal wine glass. The sharp, high-pitched ringing commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. The trap was officially springing shut. Aunt Diane looked directly down the length of the table at me, her face pulled into a mask of severe, deeply condescending disappointment. She took a deep breath, preparing to deliver her highly rehearsed monologue. "We are gathered here today to give thanks," Aunt Diane proclaimed, her voice echoing loudly in the silent dining room. "But it is incredibly difficult to feel thankful when our family is bleeding from a profound, unnatural wound. Lydia, we invited you here today because we love you, but we can no longer sit back and watch you destroy the people who gave you life." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting securely on my leather tote bag in my lap. I did not blink. I let her speak, allowing the full weight of her absurdity to fill the room. Your parents are suffering. Aunt Diane continued, her voice trembling with theatrical emotion, designed to tug at the heartstrings of our relatives. They spent their entire lives sacrificing everything to ensure you had a bright future. They raised you to be a successful, capable woman. And how do you repay them? You lock them out of their own life savings. You hack into their bank accounts and steal the very last pennies they had to their names. You left them completely destitute, unable to pay for their basic needs, all so you could throw yourself a lavish, excessive wedding without a single thought for their survival. A loud collective murmur of disgust rippled through the seated extended family. My Uncle Robert shook his head, glaring at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. Patricia let out a loud, pathetic sob, burying her face in her hands, while Richard comfortingly rubbed her back, performing their victim routine flawlessly. And your brother Aunt Diane said, pivoting her righteous anger toward Cameron's defense. Cameron has been working tirelessly to build a future for his wife. He was on the verge of a massive milestone, securing a beautiful home to start a family. You deliberately waited until the exact moment he was closing on his house to freeze the family funds. You sabotaged his dream out of nothing but pure, unadulterated spite and petty jealousy. You humiliated him, and you humiliated your parents by throwing them out of your reception with security guards like they were common criminals. I watched Cameron puff out his chest, looking around the table to soak up the sympathy of our relatives. Whitney reached over and patted his hand, playing the supportive, victimized wife enduring the cruelty of her terrible sister-in-law. This family has always stood for loyalty, forgiveness, and unity, Aunt Diane declared, raising her voice to a commanding crescendo. We do not turn our backs on our own blood over money. Your success has blinded you, Lydia. Your tech company and your new wealth have poisoned your soul. You have become a cold, calculating, greedy person who cares more about a bank balance than the mother who carried you. We staged this intervention today because we want to save you from yourself. We want to give you a chance to make this right. We want to bring you back into the fold before you do permanent, irreparable damage to your karma and your soul. She paused, letting the heavy weight of her accusations settle over the room. The sheer scale of their collective delusion was breathtaking. They had completely bought into the narrative that my parents were innocent elderly victims and that my hard-earned money belonged to the collective family pot. But returning to this family requires true accountability, Aunt Diane said, softening her tone into a sickeningly sweet maternal cadence. It requires you to surrender your pride, drop your petty grievances, and make immediate, tangible amends to the people you have deeply traumatized. You need to look your mother and father in the eye right now and apologize for the horrific stress you have caused them. You need to apologize to Cameron and Whitney for actively trying to ruin their future. And you need to restore the financial balance that you so selfishly disrupted. The entire room stared at me, waiting for me to break. They expected me to crumble under the crushing weight of their collective judgment. They expected me to burst into tears of shame, beg for their forgiveness, and hand over my financial independence to buy my way back into their good graces. They had cornered me in front of 30 people, fully believing that the sheer social pressure of this holiday ambush would force my total submission. I felt David shift next to me, his muscles tensing, ready to stand up and fiercely defend me against this room full of absolute lunatics. I gently placed my hand on his knee, silently instructing him to stay seated. I did not need defending. I was not a victim trapped in a corner. I was the architect of their impending destruction, and Aunt Diane had just handed me the exact public stage I needed to burn their entire false reality to the absolute ground. The silence stretching across the dining room was abruptly broken by the sharp, grating sound of a heavy wooden chair scraping against the polished hardwood floor. Cameron stood up from his place of honor at the head of the mahogany table. He slowly adjusted the cuffs of his expensive designer shirt, a garment that was undoubtedly paid for by the sweat of my brow, and looked down the length of the room at me. His face was arranged into an expression of profound, sickening benevolence. He was meticulously playing the role of the magnanimous older brother, the generous, level-headed patriarch, stepping in to heal the grievous wounds inflicted by his deeply flawed, erratic sister. Lydia Cameron began, his voice dripping with a practiced, condescending warmth that made my skin crawl. Aunt Diane is absolutely right. This family is bleeding today, and it is bleeding entirely because of your destructive, selfish choices. You completely derailed my real estate closing. You publicly humiliated our parents at your wedding reception. You jeopardized the foundational financial stability of this entire family unit. However, because it is Thanksgiving, I am willing to be the bigger person. I am willing to forgive your absolute lack of respect and your stunning financial betrayal. I am willing to offer you a concrete path toward redemption. He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored blazer and pulled out a thick, professionally bound legal document. He tossed it onto the polished mahogany table and gave it a firm, deliberate push. The heavy packet slid smoothly across the long surface, gliding past the crystal water goblets, the unlit decorative candles, and the silver serving trays until it came to a halt directly in front of my plate. I looked down at the document. The bold, capitalized letters on the pristine cover page spelled out a corporate equity transfer agreement. I did not need to read the microscopic fine print to know exactly what kind of brazen extortion I was looking at. "What is this, Cameron?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly flat and deliberately stripping it of any emotion that he could feed on. Cameron puffed out his chest, glancing around the room to ensure he had the rapt, undivided attention of our captive audience. "That is a legally binding contract," he declared proudly, his voice echoing in the large dining room. "Since you have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that you are completely incapable of managing your wealth with any basic sense of family loyalty or ethical responsibility, I am officially stepping in to ensure our parents are permanently protected. That contract transfers a 15% equity stake in your software company directly to my corporate holding entity." A collective murmur of approval actually rippled through the seated extended family. Uncles, aunts, and cousins nodded along, completely mesmerized by his grotesque delusion. They truly believed he was performing a noble, selfless act of family preservation. 15%. I repeated, my tone utterly deadpan, betraying absolutely nothing of the lethal trap I was preparing to spring. "Consider it a necessary structural correction," Cameron said, crossing his arms over his chest with an air of absolute authority. "It makes the family whole. It guarantees that Mom and Dad will never have to beg you for their own basic survival ever again, because I will be actively managing the corporate dividends to ensure their comprehensive care. Furthermore, it serves as appropriate legally binding compensation for the severe emotional trauma and the immense reputational damage I suffered when you deliberately sabotaged my lake house acquisition. You owe me for the substantial earnest money I lost, and you owe this family long-term financial stability." He pointed a commanding finger at the document resting near my hands. "You sign that document today, right here and right now, and we will officially welcome you back into the loving embrace of this family. You refuse, and you can walk out that front door and never speak to a single one of us ever again." Before I could even formulate a response to his breathtaking audacity, Patricia seamlessly took her cue. My mother buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with perfectly timed theatrical sobs. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. She produced genuine tears, letting them spill over her cheeks as she looked around the table at her siblings and nieces, playing the role of the ultimate devastated victim to absolute perfection. "We gave her everything," Patricia cried, her voice hitching with manufactured heartbreak. "We sacrificed our youth, our energy, and our very last dollars to make sure Lydia had every possible advantage in life. We fed her, we clothed her, and we loved her unconditionally. And how does she repay us? She left us to starve just to spite her brother. She froze our accounts and watched us suffer, smiling while we begged for mercy. We are terrified of losing our home, Diane. We are terrified of the winter. Please, Lydia, just sign the paper. Let your brother fix this terrible mess you created. Give us back our peace of mind." The emotional performance worked like an absolute charm on the uneducated audience. The extended family erupted into a chorus of aggressive, unified pressure. Uncle Robert slammed his hand on the table, pointing a stern finger in my direction. You listened to your mother. Lydia, Uncle Robert barked, his face turning a blotchy shade of red. Have you no shame? Have you no basic human decency? Your brother is offering you a highly generous way out of this shameful disaster. You sign that paper right now and you apologize to these wonderful people for the sheer terror you have put them through. Cousin Brittany chimed in from across the table, her voice dripping with venomous judgment. It is honestly disgusting that you even have to be forced into doing the right thing, Lydia. 15% is a bargain, considering the sheer amount of psychological abuse you have inflicted on Aunt Patricia and Uncle Richard. If you have even a tiny shred of a soul left inside you, you will pick up a pen and sign that contract immediately. Do not make us throw you out of this house on a holiday. Aunt Diane stood tall at the end of the table, nodding solemnly in agreement with the angry mob she had convened. The path forward is crystal clear, Lydia, she proclaimed, holding her hands out as if she were a judge delivering a final verdict. You can choose your greed or you can choose your family. We are all waiting. David shifted in his chair beside me. I could feel the intense, vibrating anger radiating from his body. He was watching my family attempt to legally rob me blind in broad daylight, using the guise of a Thanksgiving dinner to execute a coordinated corporate shakedown. He looked at me, his eyes silently asking if it was time to leave, if it was time to stand up and physically remove ourselves from this toxic, suffocating environment. I did not look at David. I did not look at the angry, glaring faces of my extended relatives. I looked straight down the length of the mahogany table, past the crystal glasses and the unlit candles, directly into the smug, arrogant eyes of my brother Cameron. He was grinning. He actually thought he had won. He firmly believed that the sheer crushing weight of 30 judging relatives would break my spirit, shatter my resolve, and force me to hand over a massive slice of my multi-million-dollar software empire, just to escape the uncomfortable social pressure of the moment. Instead of getting angry, I smiled. It was not a defensive smile. It was not a nervous, placating smile designed to ease the tension in the room. It was a slow, calm, terrifyingly cold smile. It was the smile of a predator who had just watched its prey willingly walk directly into a reinforced steel cage and lock the door from the inside. The sudden, eerie calmness of my expression caused the angry murmurs around the dining room table to slowly falter. Uncle Robert stopped yelling. Cousin Brittany furrowed her brow in deep confusion. Aunt Diane lowered her hands, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face as she realized I was not crying. I was not shaking, and I was certainly not reaching for a pen to sign their fraudulent extortion document. I slowly reached down beside my chair and picked up my heavy leather tote bag. I placed it gently on my lap. The room was now completely silent, every single eye fixed on my movements. I unzipped the top of the bag and reached inside. I bypassed my wallet, my phone, and my keys. My fingers wrapped around the thick, heavy, legally bound folder that Harrison and Mitchell had prepared for me. I stood up from my chair. The scrape of the wood against the floor echoed loudly in the quiet room. I did not rush. I walked slowly and deliberately away from the far wall, moving with absolute purpose, until I reached the very center of the long dining room table. I stood right next to the massive, beautifully roasted Thanksgiving turkey that Aunt Diane had placed on a large silver platter. I looked at Patricia, who had suddenly stopped her theatrical crying. I looked at Richard, who was gripping his bourbon glass so tightly his knuckles had turned completely white. And finally, I looked back at Cameron, whose smug, arrogant grin was beginning to melt away into a mask of genuine, creeping apprehension. I raised the thick, dense folder high in the air, ensuring every single person in the room could see the official legal seals and the stark red confidential stamps marking its cover. Then, with a swift, definitive motion, I dropped the heavy folder squarely onto the silver Thanksgiving turkey platter. It landed with a loud, resounding thud that made the crystal glasses rattle and the silverware vibrate. I kept my calm, chilling smile perfectly in place, looking directly at the people who had just tried to rob me. I was hoping we could do this publicly, I said. I was hoping we could do this publicly, I said, my voice echoing clearly over the massive Thanksgiving spread. I reached for the thick folder resting on top of the silver turkey platter. I popped open the heavy metal binder rings. Inside were 30 pristine, individually stapled copies of the final forensic accounting report. I picked up the stack and began walking slowly around the perimeter of the dining room table. I handed a copy to Uncle Robert. I handed a copy to Cousin Brittany. I handed a copy to Aunt Diane. I made absolutely certain that every single relative who had sent me a vicious text message or a screaming voicemail over the past month received their own personal hard copy evidence of my parents' massive multi-year deception. Patricia was staring at the documents in absolute horror, her theatrical tears completely drying up. Richard reached out and tried to grab a copy from Uncle Robert's hands, but my uncle pulled it away, his brow furrowing as he began to read the bold, capitalized executive summary on the very first page. I walked back to my seat beside David, holding the final master copy in my hands. The dining room was completely silent except for the crisp sound of 30 people simultaneously turning the pages of a financial audit. Let us talk about destitution. I began addressing the entire room. Let us talk about the devastating poverty that supposedly forced my parents to beg me for their basic survival. Please turn to page 3 of the report. You will find a comprehensive breakdown of Richard and Patricia's actual verified assets. Uncle Robert adjusted his reading glasses, his eyes widening as he scanned the numbers. Patricia let out a loud, panicked gasp, trying to stand up from the table. Sit down, Patricia, Aunt Diane snapped, not taking her eyes off the document in her hands. As you can clearly see, I continued, my voice steady and unwavering. My parents did not lose their retirement in a market crash 4 years ago. That was a complete fabrication. Dad's corporate pension is entirely intact and pays out securely every single month. Their investment portfolios are currently valued at over $1.2 million. They own their home, they have substantial liquid cash reserves, and they have not faced a single legitimate financial hardship in over a decade. A collective, stunned gasp rippled through the extended family. Cousin Brittany looked up from her packet, staring at my mother with an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. You told me you could not afford your blood pressure medication, Brittany whispered. You asked me to lend you $500 last Christmas. My mother's face turned a violent, blotchy shade of red. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but no words came out. The sheer, undeniable proof of her lies was sitting in the hands of 30 family members. Now let us move to page 7. I instructed, watching as the relatives obediently flipped the pages. Page 7 details exactly where my $5,000 a month actually went. It was not paying for groceries. It was not keeping the lights on. It was being systematically funneled through a shell account directly into Cameron's possession. I turned my gaze toward my brother, who was suddenly looking incredibly small at the head of the table. You will see the itemized list of expenditures funded by my hard-earned money, I stated clearly. My monthly allowance was actively subsidizing Whitney's $2,000 a month lease on a matte black Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon. It was paying for their first-class vacations to Dubai. It was purchasing $20,000 designer handbags. My parents wept to this family, claiming they were starving all so they could secretly bankroll Cameron's absurd, unearned luxury lifestyle. Aunt Diane lowered her packet, her hands visibly shaking. She looked at Richard, her brother-in-law, with profound disgust. You lied to us, Diane said, her voice dropping to a harsh, disbelieving whisper. You called me sobbing, begging me to stage this intervention because Lydia had stolen your life savings. But you were the one stealing from her. You used us to bully her into submission. Richard slammed his fist onto the table. That money belonged to the family, he roared, completely dropping the broken patriarch facade. We made a strategic decision to support our son's entrepreneurial vision. Lydia was hoarding her wealth. Hoarding my wealth? I repeated, a sharp, bitter laugh escaping me. Dad, I built a software company from nothing. I lived in a tiny studio apartment while you funneled my money to fund Cameron's delusions. But that is not even the worst part. The stolen allowance was just pocket change compared to what you did next. Please turn to page 12. The sound of pages turning filled the room again. The tension was now so thick it was suffocating. I watched as the extended family read the details of the commercial lending agreement. I watched as their expressions shifted from anger at my parents' lies to absolute bone-chilling horror. 4 years ago, I explained, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy tone. My parents took out a $400,000 home equity line of credit on their house to fund Cameron's failing businesses. When he blew through that money, they needed more. They needed millions to secure his new lake house and his fake corporate empire. But no bank would lend him that money because he is a chronic failure with 4 bankruptcies. I paused, letting the silence hang heavy over the Thanksgiving feast. So I continued. My parents committed federal wire fraud and identity theft. They used a temporary trustee status on an old dormant LLC of mine to establish a relationship with a commercial bank. They used my personal identification information. They fabricated corporate board resolutions, and they forged my signature on a corporate guarantor agreement legally binding my highly successful software company to a multi-million-dollar high-risk commercial loan for Cameron. The dining room erupted. Uncle Robert stood up from his chair, throwing his copy of the report onto the table in absolute disgust. "You forged her signature on a commercial loan," Robert yelled, his face purple with rage. "Are you insane, Richard? That is a federal crime. You put her entire company, her employees, and her livelihood at massive risk just to fund this idiot's lifestyle." Patricia began to wail, a loud, panicked, truly desperate sound. "We had to," she sobbed, reaching out toward Aunt Diane, who immediately stepped back in revulsion. Cameron was so close to making it big. We just needed to secure the capital to get his new venture off the ground. We were going to pay the loan back before Lydia even noticed. We were protecting the family legacy. "There is no family legacy," I said coldly, cutting through her theatrical sobbing. "There is only a massive, fragile house of cards built entirely on my stolen credibility. You handed my brother the keys to my kingdom, assuming I would just quietly accept the liability when he inevitably defaulted." Cameron finally spoke up, trying to project a false sense of confident authority. He stood up, smoothing the front of his designer shirt, completely ignoring the absolute disaster unfolding around him. "This is all a massive overreaction," Cameron scoffed, waving his hand dismissively at the forensic reports scattered across the table. "So what if Mom and Dad used your company as a guarantor? My new logistics venture is on the verge of a massive breakthrough. We are securing major contracts. We are going to go public within the next 18 months. I can easily pay back the commercial note and clear your company from the liability clause. This entire intervention is pointless. You should be thanking me for expanding our corporate footprint." I looked at my brother, feeling absolutely nothing but clinical, calculating detachment. He was so deeply entrenched in his own delusions that he actually believed he was the victim of a misunderstanding. He believed he was an untouchable genius who was just one big deal away from vindication. I took a slow, deliberate breath, preparing to deliver the final, fatal blow. "Cameron," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the stunned, silent dining room, "you are not going public. You are not securing major contracts. You are not expanding any corporate footprint." Cameron narrowed his eyes, his smug facade faltering for the first time. "What are you talking about?" I looked directly at him, maintaining absolute, unyielding eye contact. 3 days ago, my asset protection lawyer contacted the Executive Fraud Investigation Department at your commercial lending bank. We submitted formal declarations of forgery. We provided this exact forensic accounting report. We initiated a federal identity theft investigation against Richard and Patricia. Patricia let out a sharp, terrified scream, collapsing back into her chair. Richard's face went completely ashen, the realization of his impending criminal liability finally crashing down upon him. When the bank realized they were holding a fraudulent multi-million-dollar commercial note secured by a forged signature, I continued, "They did not just freeze your accounts, Cameron. They executed a surprise comprehensive audit on your entire business operation. They wanted to see exactly where their money was going." Cameron's face drained of all color. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning white. "And do you know what they found, Cameron?" I asked, my voice ringing with total, unadulterated justice. "They found that you have no viable product. They found that you have no actual clients. They found that you blew the loan funds on luxury cars, first-class vacations, and designer bags for your wife. You committed severe loan covenant violations, and you proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that your business is a complete fraudulent shell game. Whitney gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her hands as she looked at her husband in absolute horror. So I concluded, closing my master copy of the forensic report. The bank is not waiting 18 months for you to go public. They are not waiting for you to pay them back. They have formally and aggressively called in the loan. The entire multi-million-dollar principal is due immediately. Cameron stumbled backward, his knees hitting his chair. He looked like a man who had just been shot. No, he whispered, shaking his head frantically. They cannot do that. The loan was guaranteed by your software company. They have to come after you. I smiled, a slow, terrifyingly calm expression. No, Cameron, they do not. Because I proved my signature was forged, my company is entirely shielded from your debt. The bank legally severed my liability 3 days ago. I am completely untouchable. I turned my gaze toward my parents, who were now clinging to each other in absolute abject terror. But the bank still needs to recoup their massive losses, I stated, delivering the final devastating reality. And since they cannot touch my software company, they are executing immediate aggressive collection protocols against the actual perpetrators of the fraud. They are currently placing a massive unpayable lien on your home, Richard and Patricia. They are going to seize your house to satisfy Cameron's debt. You tried to use me as collateral to fund his empire, but all you did was guarantee your own total, unavoidable destruction. Cameron was completely silent, his jaw hanging open as the absolute magnitude of his destruction finally settled over him. The smug, arrogant grin he had worn just 10 minutes prior was gone forever, completely erased by the staggering weight of a multi-million-dollar bank lien. He stared at me, his eyes wide and panicked, as if he expected me to suddenly burst into laughter and tell him this was all a highly elaborate Thanksgiving prank. But I was not laughing. I was standing perfectly still, watching my older brother's entire fraudulent existence evaporate into thin air. "You cannot be serious!" Whitney shrieked, breaking the heavy silence that had consumed the dining room. She stood up so quickly her chair tipped backward, crashing loudly onto the hardwood floor. She pointed a manicured finger at my mother, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "You told me we were protected. You told me the company was generating revenue. You told me Cameron was a genius." Patricia began to weep hysterically, reaching her hands out toward her daughter-in-law in a desperate, pathetic attempt to maintain their alliance. "Whitney, please," Patricia sobbed, her voice cracking. "We did everything we could. We just needed a little more time." "Time," Whitney screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You do not need time, Patricia. You need a miracle. The bank is going to take my house. They are going to take my car. They are going to seize every single asset we own, because you two idiots forged a signature and got caught." I watched the glorious implosion of the golden child's marriage with absolute clinical detachment. Whitney had married Cameron because she firmly believed my parents would forever subsidize her luxury lifestyle. The moment she realized the golden goose had been permanently slaughtered, her loyalty vanished instantly. Aunt Diane stepped forward, her face a pale, grim mask of utter disgust. She looked down at Richard, who was still sitting in his chair, completely paralyzed by the impending reality of federal fraud charges. "Get out of my house," Diane said, her voice shaking with raw, unfiltered anger. "Diane, please," Richard begged, finally finding his voice. He looked up at his sister-in-law, his eyes wide with genuine terror. "We are family. You cannot just throw us out. We need a place to stay tonight. The bank is going to lock us out of our home. We need your help." "I am not helping you, Richard," Uncle Robert interjected, stepping up beside his wife and crossing his arms firmly over his chest. "You committed federal wire fraud. You stole your own daughter's identity to fund this parasitic loser's fake empire. You lied to every single person in this room, begging for our sympathy, while you were secretly sitting on a mountain of cash. You disgust me. Get out of our house right now before I call the police myself." The extended family, The very same people who had flooded my phone with vicious text messages and hateful voicemails just weeks prior were now forming a solid, unified wall of absolute condemnation against my parents. Cousin Brittany, who had threatened to ruin my professional reputation, was now staring at my mother with a look of profound, sickening revulsion. Patricia tried to stand up, but her knees buckled. She collapsed back into her chair, her hands trembling violently as she looked frantically around the room, desperately searching for a single sympathetic face. She found none. "Lydia, please," Patricia wailed, turning her tear-streaked face toward me. "You cannot do this to us. We are your parents. We raised you. We gave you everything. You have to call your lawyers. You have to tell the bank to stop the lien. We will lose our home. We will be out on the street." I looked down at the woman who had birthed me, feeling absolutely no connection to her whatsoever. She was not a mother pleading for her child's mercy. She was a cornered criminal begging her victim to take the fall for her federal crimes. "You told me not to bother you on my wedding day because you were busy funding your real child," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the silent dining room. "I am simply respecting your wishes, Patricia. I am permanently busy." I turned away from the head of the table, dismissing them completely. I looked at David, who was already standing up, offering me his hand. I took it, feeling the solid, reassuring warmth of his grip. We did not say goodbye to anyone else. We did not offer any further explanations. We simply turned our backs on the smoking crater of my family's destruction and walked out the front door. The crisp, cool autumn air hit my face the moment we stepped outside, carrying with it a profound, exhilarating sense of absolute freedom. The heavy, suffocating weight of familial obligation that had anchored me down for 33 years was finally permanently gone. I had survived their betrayal, I had exposed their massive fraud, and I had successfully protected my hard-earned legacy. Fast forward 3 months. The brutal, unavoidable consequences of their actions hit the antagonists with staggering velocity. Cameron's entire business operation was aggressively seized by the commercial bank. Federal agents arrived at his leased office space, confiscating servers, freezing accounts, and locking the doors. The massive, fraudulent corporate entity he had built was completely dismantled in a matter of days. Whitney, realizing the free money had officially dried up and her luxury lifestyle was permanently over, did exactly what I expected her to do. She filed for divorce the very next week. She hired aggressive lawyers to fight for whatever scraps were left, claiming she had no knowledge of the federal fraud her husband and his parents had committed. She moved back in with her own parents, leaving Cameron to face the absolute ruin of his life, completely alone. Richard and Patricia faced the most devastating public downfall of all. To avoid immediate federal criminal charges from the commercial bank, they were forced into a brutal settlement. They had to sign over the deed to their pristine, paid-off suburban home to satisfy a portion of Cameron's massive debt. The bank seized their property, auctioned it off, and applied the proceeds to the outstanding commercial loan. My parents were forced to downsize to a cramped, dingy 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. Because their financial crimes had been exposed at a massive holiday gathering, the news spread through their elite social circles like wildfire. They immediately lost their prestigious country club memberships. Their former friends stopped returning their calls. They were entirely ostracized by the extended family, completely cut off from the network they had relied on to validate their superiority. They were left with nothing but their intact but modest pensions, living a quiet, isolated existence in a cheap apartment, constantly looking over their shoulders, terrified that federal prosecutors might still decide to pursue criminal charges for the identity theft. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon in late February when the final, pathetic attempt at manipulation occurred. I was sitting in my spacious modern corner office at my software company headquarters, reviewing our latest quarterly revenue projections. The company was thriving, completely untethered from the massive liability my parents had tried to force upon me. My assistant buzzed me on the internal intercom, her voice tinged with slight hesitation. "Lydia," she said, "there are 2 people down in the main lobby requesting to see you. They say they are your parents." I closed the financial spreadsheet on my monitor, my expression remaining completely neutral. I stood up from my desk, smoothed the skirt of my tailored suit, and walked out of my office. I took the private executive elevator down to the ground floor. The glass doors slid open, revealing the massive, pristine corporate lobby of my building. Standing near the security turnstiles, looking older, frailer, and deeply uncomfortable, were Richard and Patricia. They were not wearing country club attire. They were wearing simple, worn winter coats. They looked exactly like what they were, two desperate people who had lost absolutely everything they valued. Lydia. Patricia gasped, stepping forward toward the glass security barriers as soon as she saw me. Thank God. We have been trying to reach you for months. I stopped walking, staying safely behind the security desk. I did not offer a greeting. I simply looked at them, waiting. Richard cleared his throat. His posture slumped, stripped of all his former patriarchal arrogance. "We need your help, Lydia," he said, his voice quiet and shaky. "The apartment rent is going up next month. The pensions barely cover our basic expenses. We are struggling to afford our medications." Patricia nodded frantically, tears welling up in her eyes. "Please, sweetheart," she begged, pressing her hands against the glass barrier. "We know we made terrible mistakes. We know we hurt you, but we are your parents. We are asking, we are begging you, can you please just reinstate the $5,000 a month, just to help us survive? We promise we will never bother you again." I stared at the two people who had given me life. The people who had praised my brother for failing while ignoring my success. The people who had committed federal identity theft to steal my company. The people who had abandoned me on my wedding day to celebrate a fraudulent lake house purchase. I felt absolutely no anger. I felt no sorrow. I felt only complete total emotional detachment. I looked at my mother, meeting her desperate pleading eyes with absolute unyielding calm. "Consider me permanently busy," I said. I turned my back on them and walked away. I did not look over my shoulder as Patricia began to sob. I did not pause as Richard called my name. I simply stepped back into the executive elevator, pressed the button for the top floor, and rode smoothly back up to the empire I had built entirely on my own. That weekend, David and I hosted a beautiful, warm dinner party in the expansive backyard of our new home. The string lights twinkled overhead, casting a soft golden glow over the long wooden table. The air was filled with genuine laughter, the clinking of wine glasses, and the comforting hum of deep, authentic conversation. Seated around our table were our chosen family. True friends who had supported me through the darkest days of my startup. Supportive colleagues who respected my leadership. David's wonderful, warm parents. And Aunt Martha, the one extended relative, who had quietly texted me her support the night I was ambushed at Thanksgiving. I sat at the head of the table, holding David's hand, looking out at the beautiful life we had created together. I raised my glass of wine, smiling as the people I loved raised theirs in return. I realized then that my ultimate wealth was not the staggering valuation of my software company. It was not the balance in my corporate accounts or the success of my business model. My ultimate wealth was the absolute peace and profound freedom of living a life completely unburdened by toxic family expectations. I had survived the fire, I had protected my legacy, and I was finally truly free. Fast forward exactly 3 months. The brutal, unavoidable consequences of their actions hit my family with staggering velocity. The commercial bank did not waste a single second attempting to negotiate with a man who had defrauded them out of millions. They moved with the cold, mechanical efficiency of a financial institution determined to completely eradicate a liability. Cameron's entire business operation was aggressively and publicly seized. Federal agents, alongside corporate bank auditors, arrived unannounced at his leased premium office space on a Tuesday morning. They did not ask politely. They confiscated his servers, froze his remaining corporate accounts, boxed up his physical files, and placed heavy steel padlocks on the glass doors. The massive, fraudulent corporate entity he had spent years pretending to build was completely dismantled in a matter of days. He watched from the sidewalk as tow trucks arrived to repossess the matte black Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon. The vehicle was unceremoniously hauled away right in front of his neighbors, destroying any lingering illusion of his success. The empire he had constantly bragged about was nothing more than a spectacular mirage, and the wind had finally blown it entirely away. He was left standing on the curb with absolutely nothing to his name except a mountain of insurmountable debt and a ruined reputation. Whitney reacted exactly the way any parasitic organism reacts when its host finally dies. She immediately detached herself to find a new source of survival. The moment she realized the free money had officially dried up and her luxury lifestyle was permanently over, she did not shed a single tear for her husband's shattered dreams. There were no supportive social media posts about weathering the storm together. There were no declarations of unconditional love. Within 48 hours of the bank seizing the vehicles and freezing their personal accounts, she packed her $20,000 designer handbags into a rented moving van and filed for divorce. She hired aggressive, cutthroat lawyers to fight for whatever pathetic scraps were left, making highly publicized claims that she had absolutely no knowledge of the federal fraud her husband and his parents had committed. She loudly proclaimed herself a victim of Cameron's deception, expertly shifting the blame to save her own skin. She moved back into her parents' basement, leaving Cameron to face the absolute ruin of his life completely alone. Her social media accounts, which had once been a shrine to their stolen wealth, were hastily scrubbed clean of any evidence that Cameron had ever existed in her life. She erased him just as easily as she had spent my money. Richard and Patricia faced the most devastating public downfall of all. They had built their entire identities on the perception of affluent suburban superiority. They believed they were untouchable architects of their own reality. But the commercial bank did not care about their country club status or their carefully curated neighborhood image. To avoid immediate federal criminal charges and lengthy prison sentences for wire fraud and identity theft, my parents were forced into a brutal, non-negotiable settlement. The bank demanded total liquidation. My parents had to sign over the deed to their pristine, paid-off suburban home to satisfy a portion of Cameron's massive commercial debt. The very house where they had hosted countless elegant dinner parties, where they had sneered at my career choices, and where they had planned their financial crimes was ripped from their hands. The bank seized the property, auctioned it off to the highest bidder, and applied the proceeds to the outstanding loan balance. The physical toll of this forced eviction was absolute poetry. Richard and Patricia had to pack up 3 decades of accumulated wealth and memories into cheap cardboard boxes. They had to watch as estate liquidators auctioned off their antique furniture, their expensive art, and their crystal dining sets because they could no longer afford to store or transport them. They were forced to downsize to a cramped, dingy 2-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. The new apartment complex had peeling paint-stained carpets and a rattling heating system that barely functioned during the bitter Chicago winter. It was a dark, depressing space that perfectly mirrored the desolate reality of their new lives. They went from hosting lavish garden parties to listening to their neighbors argue through paper-thin walls. The luxurious safety net they thought they had secured by stealing my identity had morphed into a claustrophobic prison of their own making. The financial ruin was only the beginning of their punishment. Because their financial crimes had been exposed at a massive holiday gathering with hard forensic evidence, the news spread through their elite social circles like a wildfire. Aunt Diane, Uncle Robert, and Cousin Brittany did not keep the Thanksgiving ambush a secret. In fact, they weaponized it. The extended family felt deeply humiliated that they had been manipulated into attacking me on behalf of 2 federal criminals. To clear their own names and salvage their own reputations, my relatives loudly and publicly condemned Richard and Patricia to anyone who would listen. They made sure every single person in our extended network knew exactly who the real villains were. The social fallout was instantaneous and absolute. The exclusive country club where my parents had spent the last 20 years drinking martinis and gossiping about the less fortunate quietly but firmly revoked their membership. The board of directors cited a strict morals clause in the membership agreement, refusing to associate the club's prestigious name with individuals currently under investigation by commercial banking fraud departments. My parents, former friends, the wealthy suburbanites, They had desperately tried to impress, completely stopped returning their calls. Invitations to holiday galas, charity dinners, and neighborhood block parties instantly ceased. They were entirely ostracized by the extended family cut off from the network they had relied on to validate their inherent superiority. There were no more Sunday brunches with Aunt Diane. There were no more golf outings with Uncle Robert. Even Cousin Brittany, who had been perfectly willing to help them extort me for 15% of my company, suddenly acted as if she had never met them. They were completely isolated, radioactive to anyone who valued their own social standing. The psychological devastation of this isolation broke them faster than the loss of their wealth. Richard and Patricia had always believed that their bloodline entitled them to unconditional respect and automatic forgiveness. They firmly believed that no matter how horribly they treated me, the rest of the world would always view them as respectable, upstanding citizens. But the forensic accounting report had stripped away their masks, leaving them completely exposed to the harsh, glaring light of public judgment. They were no longer the proud, successful parents of a visionary entrepreneur. They were common fraudsters who had sacrificed their own daughter on the altar of their son's pathetic vanity. They were left with absolutely nothing but their intact but incredibly modest pensions, living a quiet, isolated existence in their cheap apartment. They spent their days constantly looking over their shoulders, terrified that federal prosecutors might still decide to pursue criminal charges for the identity theft, despite the bank settlement. The anxiety ate away at them, aging them dramatically in just 3 short months. Richard lost his proud, imposing posture, developing a nervous shuffle. Patricia lost her theatrical, haughty energy, her face drawn and pale without the expensive cosmetic treatments she could no longer afford. They had traded their beautiful home, their flawless reputation, and their relationship with a daughter who genuinely loved them all for the sake of funding a luxury car and a fake business for a son who was currently living in a cheap motel, avoiding their calls. The dominoes they had set up over the past 4 years had not just fallen, they had completely pulverized the ground beneath their feet. They had absolutely no one to blame but themselves, and the sheer deafening silence of their new cramped apartment forced them to confront that reality every single day. They were utterly permanently ruined. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon in late February when the final pathetic attempt at manipulation occurred. I was sitting in my spacious modern corner office at my software company headquarters, reviewing our latest quarterly revenue projections. The company was thriving completely untethered from the massive liability my parents had tried to force upon me. My assistant buzzed me on the internal intercom, her voice tinged with slight hesitation. She informed me that there were 2 people down in the main lobby requesting to see me. She said they claimed to be my parents, but they looked incredibly distressed and were causing a minor scene near the security desk. I closed the financial spreadsheet on my high-resolution monitor, my expression remaining completely neutral. I stood up from my ergonomic desk, smoothed the skirt of my tailored designer suit, and walked out of my private office. I took the private executive elevator down to the ground floor. The heavy metal doors slid open seamlessly, revealing the massive, pristine corporate lobby of my building. The space was an architectural marvel of polished marble, gleaming glass, and high-end security systems designed to keep unauthorized personnel firmly outside. Standing near the reinforced glass security turnstiles, looking older, frailer, and deeply uncomfortable, were Richard and Patricia. The sheer visual contrast between the towering modern architecture of my corporate headquarters and their diminished physical presence was absolutely staggering. I stood just inside the elevator bay for a long moment, simply observing them from a safe distance. They were not wearing the expensive country club attire they used to flaunt at family gatherings. They were not draped in designer labels or fine jewelry. They were wearing simple, worn winter coats that looked entirely inadequate for the bitter Chicago wind. Richard was nervously wringing his hands, twisting a faded wool cap between his fingers. His proud, arrogant posture had completely collapsed, leaving him hunched and defeated. Patricia kept looking around the pristine lobby with wide, anxious eyes, flinching every time a suited executive walked past her. They looked exactly like what they were, 2 desperate people who had lost absolutely everything they valued. They looked entirely out of place, completely stripped of the suburban armor they had worn for my entire life. I felt no surge of triumphant joy watching them cower in the lobby of the building they had literally tried to steal from me. I felt no lingering, burning anger. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of profound, absolute indifference. I walked slowly across the polished marble floor, my high heels clicking with rhythmic precision against the stone. The security guard stationed at the front desk immediately stood up straighter, recognizing my approach. I gave the head of security a subtle professional nod, indicating that he should not allow my uninvited guests past the reinforced glass turnstiles under any circumstances. I stopped walking, leaving a solid, unyielding physical barrier between my toxic parents and my protected world. Patricia gasped loudly, stepping forward and pressing her bare hands against the cold glass barrier the moment she saw me approaching. Lydia, she cried out, her voice cracking with a carefully manufactured desperation designed to draw sympathy from the onlookers in the lobby. Thank God you came down. We have been trying to reach you for months. The phone numbers we have do not work anymore. We did not know where else to go. We are completely out of options. I did not offer a polite greeting. I did not ask how they were doing or how they were adjusting to their new reality. I kept my hands folded neatly in front of me and stared at them with eyes devoid of any familial warmth. State your business, I said, my voice matching the freezing winter temperature raging outside the revolving glass doors. Richard stepped up beside his wife, swallowing hard. He could not even maintain basic eye contact, looking down at his scuffed shoes before finally forcing himself to look at me. We need your help, Lydia, he said, his voice shaking with a pathetic weakness that I had never heard from him before. The rent on the new apartment is going up next month. The basic utility bills are suffocating us. The pensions barely cover our minimal living expenses, let alone the medical costs your mother is incurring from the severe stress of this entire ordeal. We are struggling just to keep the heat on and buy weekly groceries. We have absolutely nothing left. Patricia nodded frantically, fresh tears welling up in her eyes and spilling over her pale cheeks. Please, sweetheart, she begged, her voice taking on that familiar, sickeningly sweet cadence she always used when she wanted to manipulate me into compliance. We know we made terrible mistakes. We know we hurt you deeply. We let the immense pressure of Cameron's financial situation cloud our judgment, and we deeply regret everything that happened at the wedding and at Aunt Diane's house. But we are still your parents. We are asking you, we are begging you on our hands and knees right now. Can you please just reinstate the $5,000 a month, just to help us survive the winter? We promise we will never bother you again. We will stay completely out of your life if you just give us enough to pay our rent. I stood perfectly still, listening to their pathetic pleas and analyzing the exact structure of their so-called apology. They did not apologize for committing federal wire fraud. They did not apologize for stealing my identity or risking the livelihoods of my employees. They did not apologize for calling me a narcissistic, greedy monster in front of 30 relatives at Thanksgiving. They simply apologized for letting the pressure cloud their judgment. Even now, completely broken and facing absolute ruin, they were still trying to minimize their horrific criminal actions and distribute the blame away from themselves. They were not sorry for what they did to me. They were simply sorry that they had lost their pristine suburban house and their elite country club memberships. They just wanted their automated teller machine to start dispensing cash again. I looked at the two people who had given me life. The people who had praised my brother for failing while actively ignoring my hard-earned success. The people who had committed federal identity theft to sacrifice my company on the altar of his unearned vanity. The people who had casually abandoned me on my wedding day to celebrate a fraudulent lake house purchase. The invisible, heavy chains of guilt and obligation that they had wrapped around my neck since childhood had completely rusted away, leaving me entirely free. I leaned slightly closer to the glass barrier, ensuring my voice would carry clearly to them without needing to raise it. I looked my mother directly in her desperate, pleading eyes, meeting her frantic gaze with absolute, unyielding calm. You told me not to bother you on my wedding day because you were busy funding your real child. I said, my words slicing through the lobby with surgical precision. Consider me permanently busy. Patricia let out a loud, sharp wail, her hands sliding down the glass barrier as her knees buckled slightly. Richard closed his eyes, a look of total, absolute defeat washing over his aged face. I did not stay to watch them cry. I did not wait for a rebuttal or another round of pathetic excuses. I turned my back on them and walked away. I did not look over my shoulder as Patricia began to sob my name into the quiet lobby. I did not pause as Richard begged me to come back. I simply stepped into the private executive elevator, pressed the button for the top floor, and rode smoothly back up to the empire I had built entirely on my own. I never saw or spoke to Richard and Patricia ever again. Spring arrived in Chicago a few months later, melting away the bitter winter freeze and breathing vibrant new life into the city. David and I decided it was the perfect time to host a celebration. We were not celebrating a holiday or a corporate milestone. We were celebrating our genuine, untethered happiness and the beautiful future we were building together. We hosted a warm, elegant dinner party in the expansive, newly landscaped backyard of our home. String lights twinkled brightly overhead, casting a soft golden glow over the long wooden dining table. The evening air was filled with loud, genuine laughter, the musical clinking of expensive wine glasses, and the comforting, steady hum of deep, authentic conversation. Seated around our long table were the incredible people who comprised our chosen family. These were true friends who had supported me through the darkest, most terrifying days of launching my startup software company. These were supportive, brilliant colleagues who respected my leadership and stood by my side when my professional reputation was on the line. David's wonderful, warm parents were there, sharing stories and treating me with the profound maternal and paternal love I had always craved but never received from my own blood relatives. Sitting near the center of the table, laughing warmly at a joke David just told, was Aunt Martha, the one single extended relative who had quietly texted me her unwavering support the night I was aggressively ambushed at Thanksgiving. She had seen the truth through the thick fog of my parents' lies, and she had bravely chosen integrity over blind, toxic family loyalty. I sat at the head of the table, holding David's hand firmly under the crisp, white linen tablecloth. I looked out at the beautiful, vibrant life we had created together. I watched my friends passing plates of delicious catered food, pouring rich red wine, and sharing unburdened joy. There were no hidden agendas at this table. There were no manipulative guilt trips, no secret financial demands, and absolutely no golden children sucking the oxygen out of the room. Every single person sitting in my backyard was there because they genuinely loved me, valued me, and respected the hard boundaries I had drawn to protect my peace. I raised my glass of wine, smiling a genuine, radiant smile as the people I loved raised their glasses in return, toasting to health and happiness. As the rich wine warmed my chest, I experienced a moment of profound, absolute clarity. For 33 years, I had operated under the terrible delusion that my worth was intrinsically tied to my parents' approval and my financial utility to their toxic ecosystem. I had driven myself to the brink of exhaustion trying to buy their love with $5,000 monthly installments. Looking around at the spectacular life I had fiercely defended and maintained, I realized then that my ultimate wealth was not the staggering multi-million-dollar valuation of my software company. It was not the massive balance in my corporate accounts or the unprecedented success of my business model. My ultimate wealth was the absolute peace and profound, unshakable freedom of living a life completely unburdened by toxic family expectations. I had survived the fire, I had protected my legacy, and I was finally truly forever free. As I look back on everything that happened, from the empty chairs at my wedding to the shocking discovery of my forged signature, the greatest lesson I learned wasn't about business or finance. It was about the true definition of family and self-worth. For years, I believed that love meant carrying the crushing weight of my parents' expectations. I sacrificed my youth and my hard-earned money to buy their affection, transferring $5,000 every single month under the illusion of familial duty. But I learned the hard way that you cannot buy the love of people who view you only as a convenient resource to exploit. Toxic people will drain your bank account, your energy, and your spirit without a second thought to fund their own selfish delusions. The moment I froze those accounts and walked down the aisle alone, I finally took my power back. I learned that setting boundaries isn't an act of cruelty, it is a necessary act of survival. I realized that my ultimate wealth isn't the multi-million-dollar valuation of my software company. Ultimate wealth is the absolute peace and profound freedom of living a life completely unburdened by toxic family expectations. Family is not simply the bloodline you are born into. It is the chosen circle of friends, colleagues, and loved ones who celebrate your success and stand fiercely by your side in your darkest hours. If you are constantly exhausting yourself to earn the approval of people who only take from you, it is time to cut the cord. Have you ever had to draw a hard line to protect your peace and your future from toxic family members? Share your story in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit that like and subscribe button for more stories about reclaiming your power and building the life you truly deserve.